What does it take to break a man who never believed he could fall? Not scandal, not ruin, not even death. Sometimes, all it takes is the quiet footsteps of a woman walking away. Stay with me until the end of this story. I promise you'll witness something most people never see. The exact moment a powerful man realizes he's already lost everything that mattered. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find a piece of yourself in the wreckage. The first snowfall of December arrived 3 days after Duke Cedric Blackthorne received his death sentence. He stood at the window of his private study, watching white flakes settle over the manicured gardens of Blackthorne Manor like a funeral shroud. The physician's words still echoed in his skull. 6 months, perhaps less. The disease spreading through his blood like poison in a well. Incurable, irreversible, fatal. Cedric had faced assassins, political enemies, and battlefield carnage without flinching. But this quiet erasure of his existence felt obscene. Behind him, the study door opened without knocking. Only one person in the entire duchy had that privilege anymore. Lady Vivian Ashcombe entered carrying a leather portfolio, her movements precise and unhurried. 10 years of marriage had stripped away the softness she'd brought to Blackthorne Manor, replacing it with something harder, something that resembled marble more than flesh. Her dark hair was pulled back severely. Her gray eyes held no warmth. She'd stopped crying 3 years ago. Cedric couldn't remember exactly when. "I need to discuss the Haverford contracts," she said. Her voice was flat, businesslike. "The estate manager sent the revised terms this morning." Cedric turned from the window. Vivian stood near the desk, not approaching, maintaining the careful distance that had become their normal. She wore a navy dress buttoned to her throat. No jewelry, no ornament. She'd stopped wearing the sapphire necklace he'd given her on their first anniversary after she'd discovered it was identical to the one he'd purchased for his mistress. "The Haverford contracts can wait," Cedric said. "We need to talk about your diagnosis?" Vivian's interruption was surgical. "I already spoke with Dr. Pemberton. He outlined the treatment protocol and estimated timeline." She set the portfolio on his desk, her fingers not trembling even slightly. Cedric found himself staring at those hands. They'd once touched him with tenderness. Now they simply moved through necessary tasks, efficient and cold. "Vivian," he started, then stopped. He didn't know what he wanted to say. Something about fear, maybe. About not wanting to face this alone, but the words felt absurd in his mouth. "I've arranged for a rotation of nurses," Vivian continued, pulling papers from the portfolio. "Dr. Pemberton recommended 3 specialists. I've scheduled consultations with all of them. The household staff has been briefed on the necessary adjustments to your diet and medication schedule." "Stop," Cedric said. She looked up, one eyebrow raised in polite inquiry. "Just stop for a moment." He crossed to the desk, getting closer than propriety allowed in their careful dance of avoidance. "I'm dying, Vivian. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" Her expression didn't change. "It means I need to prepare the estate for transition of power. It means updating your will, settling outstanding debts, and ensuring the duchy doesn't collapse into chaos when you're gone." "Christ," he breathed. "Do you feel anything anymore?" Something flickered behind her eyes, brief as lightning, gone as fast. "I feel quite a lot, Your Grace, but my feelings are no longer your concern." She turned to leave. "Vivian, wait." She paused at the door but didn't face him. "I know I haven't been—" Cedric struggled for words that weren't complete lies. "Things between us have been difficult, but I need you now. I need—" The door closed softly behind her. Cedric stood alone in his study, surrounded by the trappings of power and privilege, and felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Helplessness. He didn't know yet that helplessness was just the beginning. That night, Cedric's mistress arrived at the manor. Lady Margot Sinclair swept into the dining room like she owned it, her red dress cut scandalously low, her perfume announcing her presence before she appeared. She'd been Cedric's companion, the polite term everyone pretended to believe, for the past 4 years. Beautiful, clever, utterly unconcerned with discretion. "Darling," she purred, settling into the chair beside him without invitation. "I heard the most dreadful rumors. Surely they can't be true." Across the table, Vivian continued cutting her chicken with mechanical precision. She didn't look up. "I'm ill," Cedric said. It's serious. Margot's hand flew to her chest in theatrical distress. Oh, my darling, how terrible. You must let me nurse you back to health. I'll cancel all my engagements. We'll go to the seaside villa, just the two of us. I don't think that's appropriate, Cedric interrupted, acutely aware of Vivian's presence. Given the circumstances. Margot's eyes narrowed. What circumstances? Surely you're not going to let propriety stand in the way of your happiness now, of all times. Vivian set down her silverware with a soft click that somehow commanded the room's attention. If you'll excuse me, I've lost my appetite. She stood, her napkin folded precisely beside her plate. Vivian, Cedric said. She walked out. Margot laughed, the sound sharp and crystalline. Really, Cedric? Why do you even bother? She clearly doesn't care. But she did care, Cedric thought, watching the empty doorway. Or she had. Once. That was the problem. He'd spent so many years taking Vivian's devotion for granted that he'd forgotten it was something that could be lost. The next morning, Vivian was gone before sunrise. Cedric found her in the estate's business office, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence. She'd clearly been there for hours, judging by the empty teacup and the neat stacks of organized documents. We need to talk, he said. I'm listening. She didn't look up from her writing. Not here. Privately. This is private enough. Cedric closed the door anyway, turning the lock. The small click made Vivian's hand pause over the paper, just for a second. Last night was inappropriate, he said. I shouldn't have allowed Margot to... To what? Vivian's voice remained level. To visit her lover? To dine in his home? You've allowed considerably more for the past 4 years, Your Grace. Things are different now. Because you're dying... She finally looked at him, and the absence of emotion in her eyes was more cutting than any accusation. Does terminal illness suddenly grant you morality you lacked when you were healthy? That's not fair, isn't it? Vivian stood, moving to the window. Beyond the glass, servants bustled across the courtyard, carrying on with ordinary life while their master confronted his mortality. Tell me, Cedric, when was the last time you considered what was fair to me? He had no answer for that. Do you remember our wedding night? She asked, her voice conversational. You were drunk. You called me by another woman's name. I cried myself to sleep while you snored beside me, and I told myself it was just nerves, just the stress of the day. Things would be better in the morning. Vivian, in the morning, you were gone before I woke. You spent the entire week of our honeymoon at your club, gambling and drinking with your friends. I ate every meal alone in a house full of servants who pitied me. I was young, Cedric said weakly. Stupid. You were 28 years old, hardly a boy. She turned from the window and the winter light behind her made her seem almost translucent, like a ghost of herself. But I forgave you. I told myself you needed time to adjust to married life, that you'd grow to care for me eventually. And then there was Lady Charlotte, Vivian continued, her tone never rising above that terrible calm. You were discreet at first. I might never have known if she hadn't sent me a note, gloating about your passion, describing in vivid detail exactly what you did to her in the garden house while I was visiting my mother's grave. Cedric felt his stomach twist. He'd forgotten about Charlotte's letter, or maybe he'd just never known Vivian had received it. I burned the letter, Vivian said, and I forgave you again. Because I loved you, Cedric. God help me, I loved you so much it made me stupid. Past tense, he noticed. Loved. Then came Amelia, and after her, that opera singer whose name I can't even remember. And through all of it, I stood beside you at state functions, smiled for the cameras, played the devoted Duchess, while everyone whispered behind my back. I never asked you to endure that, Cedric said. Vivian laughed, a sound like breaking glass. No. You just asked me to be your wife, to honor and cherish you, to sacrifice my pride, my dignity, my self-respect on the altar of your happiness. Small favors, really. She moved back to the desk, gathering papers with brisk efficiency. But here's what you never bothered to notice, Your Grace. 3 years ago, on the night of the Winter Gala, your political enemies tried to destroy you with evidence of illegal trading violations. Do you remember that night? Cedric frowned. The accusations were proven false. They were true, Vivian said flatly. You'd been skimming tariffs from the shipping contracts for months, too drunk and distracted to cover your tracks properly. Lord Rothfield had documentation that would have ruined you. That's impossible. The evidence disappeared. I made it disappear. She met his eyes. I spent £50,000 of my personal inheritance buying those documents from Rothfield's clerk. Then I fabricated alternative records and paid 3 magistrates to certify them. You never knew because you never asked. You just assumed the problem solved itself. Cedric felt the floor shift beneath him. 2 years ago, when the Merchants Guild threatened to revoke your trading licenses, I negotiated a settlement by promising to invest in their new textile mill. Last year, when that scandal with the chambermaid threatened to explode, I paid her family £20,000 for their silence and found her a position in France where she could start over. Why? The word came out hoarse. Why would you do all that? Because I was your wife. She said it simply, like the answer should have been obvious. Because I believed in the vows I took, even when you made a mockery of them. Cedric reached for the desk to steady himself. He'd always assumed his political survival was due to his own cunning, his strategic brilliance. The idea that Vivian, quiet, decorative Vivian, had been orchestrating his protection for years felt like learning he'd been walking on a frozen lake, unaware of the ice beneath his feet. Vivian, I didn't know. I never realized. Of course you didn't, she interrupted. You never saw me as anything more than an accessory, a well-bred woman to hang on your arm and manage your household. It never occurred to you that I had intelligence, capability, agency of my own. She crossed to the door, unlocking it with steady fingers. For 10 years, I gave you everything, she said. My love, my loyalty, my protection, my silence. I made you successful while you made me small. And the worst part? I did it willingly. I erased myself piece by piece, thinking someday you'd notice. Someday you'd choose me. The door swung open. But you never did, Vivian finished. And now? Now I'm done waiting. She walked out, leaving Cedric alone with the ledgers that documented a decade of sacrifice he'd never noticed. Gossips. The following week, Cedric's condition worsened. The headaches started first, blinding spikes of pain that left him gasping. Then came the weakness, his legs trembling when he stood too quickly. Dr. Pemberton prescribed bed rest and medication, warning that stress would accelerate the disease's progression. Vivian managed everything with ruthless efficiency. She coordinated with physicians, organized the household, responded to the flood of concerned correspondence from nobles and politicians. She did it all with the cool competence of a general managing a campaign. She also slept in a different wing of the manor. One night, fevered and alone, Cedric rang for her. The maid who answered looked uncomfortable. Lady Vivian is indisposed, Your Grace. I don't care. Tell her I need her. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Cedric was beginning to think she wouldn't come when his bedroom door finally opened. Vivian entered wearing a dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked impossibly young like this, vulnerable in a way she never appeared during daylight hours. For a moment, Cedric remembered their early days before everything turned bitter. You called for me, she said. What do you need? Stay, he said. Please, just for tonight. Something in her expression shifted, a flash of pain quickly suppressed. Cedric, I know I have no right to ask. I know I've forfeited any claim to your comfort. But I'm frightened, Vivian. I'm dying and I'm terrified, and I don't want to be alone. She stood frozen in the doorway, and for the first time in years, Cedric saw genuine emotion on her face. Not love. That was long dead. But something softer than the ice she usually showed him. Maybe pity. Maybe just exhaustion. You were never afraid to be alone before, she said quietly. All those nights you spent in Margot's bed, you didn't seem frightened then. That was different. How? I didn't need you then. And there it is, Vivian said. The truth you can't even hear yourself speak. She moved into the room, but not toward the bed. Instead, she went to the chair by the window, sitting with her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. The distance between them might as well have been an ocean. I'll stay until you fall asleep, she said. But don't mistake my presence for forgiveness, Cedric. This is duty, nothing more. He wanted to argue, to tell her that surely somewhere beneath all that frost, some remnant of her old affection survived. But the words died in his throat because he knew the answer. Vivian sat motionless as a statue, and Cedric drifted into fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of walking through empty rooms, calling for someone who no longer answered. The scandal broke 3 days before Christmas. Lord Ashford's weekly gossip column published details about Cedric's illness, complete with gleeful speculation about the duchy's future and thinly veiled suggestions that his moral corruption had brought about divine punishment. The article included a cartoonish illustration of Cedric in bed, with Lady Margot feeding him grapes, while a shadowy female figure, clearly meant to be Vivian, walked away carrying bags of money. The implication was clear: Vivian was abandoning her dying husband for financial gain. Cedric was in the library when he read it, and the rage that consumed him felt almost therapeutic after weeks of helpless fear. He threw the newspaper across the room, sending it crashing into a shelf of first editions. "How dare they?" he snarled. "How dare they suggest you're anything but loyal?" Vivian, sitting nearby with her embroidery, didn't look up. "They're not entirely wrong." "What?" "I am leaving," she said calmly. The needle moved in and out of the fabric with steady rhythm, just not for the reasons they imagine. Cedric stared at her. "Leaving?" "Yes. When?" "After the New Year. I've arranged for a cottage in Cornwall. Quite remote. I think I'll like the solitude." The world seemed to tilt. "You can't be serious." "I'm perfectly serious." Vivian finally raised her eyes from her work, and the finality in her gaze made Cedric's blood run cold. "I've already spoken to my solicitor. The divorce papers will be filed next week." "Divorce?" He nearly choked on the word. "You can't divorce me. I'm dying." "Precisely why I need to leave now," she said, "before your death complicates the legal proceedings." Cedric crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbing the arms of her chair and caging her in. "You would humiliate me like this? In my final months?" "I would free myself," Vivian corrected, still unruffled by his proximity, "while I still have time to build a life that doesn't revolve around your needs." "What about your vows?" "Your duty?" "I fulfilled my duty," she said. "For 10 years, I fulfilled it while you broke yours repeatedly. Now I'm choosing myself." "People will destroy you," Cedric hissed. "Society won't forgive a woman who abandons her dying husband." Vivian smiled, and the expression was so foreign on her face it looked almost wrong. "Let them try." "I stopped caring about society's opinion when they spent a decade watching you parade your mistresses around and said nothing." She pushed him back gently, firmly, rising from her chair with her embroidery gathered in her arms. "You're not the only one who's dying, Cedric," she said softly. "I've been dying by inches for years, suffocated by a marriage that asked me to be smaller, quieter, less than human. The only difference is I've decided to stop." She walked to the door, then paused. "I'll have the divorce papers sent to your study tomorrow morning. I suggest you sign them. Fighting me will only make this uglier than it needs to be. And if I refuse?" "Then I'll take this public," Vivian said. "Every mistress, every scandal, every debt I paid, every enemy I neutralized on your behalf. I'll write a memoir that makes Lord Ashford's column look like a love letter. By the time I'm finished, your legacy will be ashes. The threat wasn't delivered with heat or anger, just cold, incontrovertible fact." "You've changed," Cedric said numbly. "No," Vivian replied. "I've just stopped pretending." The divorce papers arrived on Christmas Eve. Cedric stared at them for 3 hours, reading and rereading the precise legal language that would sever 10 years of marriage. The settlement was shockingly generous. Vivian asked for almost nothing: a small annual stipend, the Cornwall cottage, and some personal effects. She was leaving him the estate, the title, the fortune. She just wanted her freedom. "Sign them," Dr. Pemberton advised when he arrived for the evening examination. "Let her go, Your Grace. Stress is killing you faster than the disease." But Cedric couldn't sign. Not yet, because signing meant accepting that he'd lost something he'd never appreciated until it was gone. He spent Christmas Day alone. Vivian took her meals in her rooms. The servants moved through the manor like ghosts, embarrassed witnesses to their master's unraveling. On Boxing Day, Cedric's mother arrived. Dowager Duchess Eleanor Blackthorne swept into his study with the imperious energy that had terrified him since childhood. She was 73, small as a bird, and possessed the emotional warmth of January frost. "You've made a mess," she announced without preamble. "Disappointing, but not surprising." "Mother," Cedric said wearily, "I don't have the strength for your criticism today." "Clearly, you don't have the strength for much anymore." She settled into the chair across from his desk, her black dress rustling. "I read the papers. Divorce. How modern. How embarrassing. Vivian is leaving me. Yes, I'm aware. Eleanor's lips pursed. I came to tell you that I approve. Cedric blinked. You what? I approve of her decision. That girl showed more spine in one choice than you've demonstrated in your entire life. She's abandoning me while I'm dying. She's saving herself while you're dying, Eleanor corrected. There's a distinction, though I doubt you're capable of seeing it. She stood, moving to the window with the same restless energy that had always characterized her. I never liked you, Cedric, she said conversationally. I know mothers are supposed to love their children unconditionally, but I always found you weak. Entitled. Your father spoiled you beyond recognition. This isn't helping, Cedric muttered. When you married Vivian, I thought perhaps she might make something of you, Eleanor continued. She was intelligent, graceful, strong. Too good for you, certainly, but I hoped she might elevate you through proximity. She turned from the window, and her eyes, the same gray as Vivian's, Cedric realized with uncomfortable clarity, held nothing but contempt. Instead, you spent a decade destroying her, Eleanor said. You took a woman of substance and ground her down until she was barely recognizable. And now, when you finally need her, when you finally want what she offered freely for years, you're shocked to discover the well has run dry. I loved her, Cedric said. The words felt like confession and lie simultaneously. No, Eleanor replied. You loved the idea of her. You loved having a beautiful, devoted wife who made you look respectable. You never loved Vivian herself, the woman with thoughts, feelings, needs of her own. She collected her gloves from the desk. Sign the papers, she advised. Let her go. It's the only decent thing you've done in years. What if I can't? Cedric asked. What if I need her? Then you'll die wanting, Eleanor said simply. Which is precisely what you deserve. She left without saying goodbye. Cedric sat alone in the study until long after dark, the unsigned divorce papers mocking him from the desk. Musset. New Year's Eve arrived with the kind of brittle, frozen clarity that makes everything seem preternaturally sharp. Cedric woke early, his body racked with pain that the morphine barely touched. Dr. Pemberton had warned that the final stages would be like this, every nerve ending on fire, every breath a conscious effort. He found Vivian in the morning room, supervising the packing of her personal belongings. Trunks and cases lined the walls. The room looked like it was being stripped bare. You're really leaving, he said. Tomorrow morning, she confirmed. The movers will collect the rest next week. Cedric watched her fold a shawl, cream-colored silk he'd given her on their second anniversary. She handled it without sentimentality, just another item to pack. Vivian, he said, please look at me. She did, and the absence of anything resembling affection in her eyes nearly broke him. I'm sorry, he said, for everything. For every hurt, every betrayal, every moment I made you feel less than you were. I know, she said. Can you forgive me? Vivian tilted her head, considering. Eventually, probably. Forgiveness is healing, and I plan to heal. Then stay, Cedric begged. If you can forgive me, I said eventually, Vivian interrupted. Not now. Not while you're still alive to mistake my forgiveness for permission to hurt me again. I won't. I swear. I'll change. You're dying, Cedric. You don't have time to change. She resumed her packing. This conversation is pointless. I love you. The words hung in the air between them. Cedric had said them before, of course, at their wedding, on anniversaries, in moments when Vivian seemed particularly upset. But he'd never meant them the way he meant them now, with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for driftwood. Vivian set down the shawl carefully. Do you know what love is, Cedric? She asked. Real love. Not the romantic fantasy you're imagining right now because you're frightened and alone. Tell me, he said. Love is showing up, she said, every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Love is choosing someone again and again, putting their needs beside your own, protecting them when they're vulnerable. She moved closer, and Cedric's heart leaped with desperate hope. For 10 years I loved you like that, Vivian said. I showed up every single day. I chose you over myself so many times I forgot I had a self to choose. And you know what you did? What? You loved yourself more, she said simply. Every time. You chose your pleasure, your pride, your comfort over me. That's not love, Cedric. That's narcissism with romantic window dressing. She stepped back, and the distance felt final. So no, I don't believe you love me, she continued. I think you love the idea of not dying alone. I think you love having someone witness your suffering, validate your pain. But me? The actual woman standing in front of you? I don't think you've ever really seen me at all. The truth of it crashed over Cedric like a wave. She was right. God help him. She was completely right. The divorce papers, Vivian said. Did you sign them? No. Sign them tonight, she said, or I'll have my solicitor file without your consent. It will be messier that way, but I'm prepared for messy. She returned to her packing, dismissing him with her indifference more effectively than any anger could have. Cedric left the morning room and went to his study. The papers sat where he'd left them, pristine and damning. His hand shook as he picked up the pen. The signature took less than 3 seconds. 10 years of marriage ended with a scrawl of ink. He rang for a servant to deliver the signed documents to Vivian's room. Then he sat at his desk and wept like he hadn't since he was a child. Great heaving sobs that tore through him and left him hollow. Because he finally understood. He'd spent 10 years with a woman who would have walked through fire for him, and he'd never even noticed she was burning. Quote, midnight struck with church bells echoing across the frozen estate. Cedric stood at his bedroom window, watching fireworks bloom over the distant village. Celebration. A new year. Fresh starts for everyone except him. A knock at the door made him turn. Vivian stood in the hallway, wrapped in her traveling cloak, a small case in her hand. I'm leaving now, she said. Now? Cedric checked the clock. It's past midnight. I know. She stepped into the room, and he noticed for the first time the dark circles under her eyes, the weight she'd lost over the past months. I couldn't wait until morning. Every hour in this house feels like drowning. Cedric moved toward her, then stopped, unsure if she'd tolerate his proximity. Please don't go, he whispered. I have to. Just one more night. He heard the pathetic desperation in his voice, but couldn't stop it. Give me one more night to memorize your face, to remember what it felt like when you were mine. I was never yours, Cedric, Vivian said gently. That was always the problem. You wanted ownership, not partnership. She set down her case and did something unexpected. She crossed to him, standing close enough that he could smell her perfume, that subtle lavender scent he'd stopped noticing years ago. I want you to understand something, she said. This isn't revenge. I'm not leaving to punish you. Then why? Because I deserve more, she said. I deserve to be someone's first choice, not their convenient option. I deserve to wake up without wondering who my husband is fucking. I deserve to feel like a whole person instead of a beautiful accessory. Her hand rose, and for one wild moment, Cedric thought she might touch his face. Instead, she brushed past him to the window, looking out at the fireworks. When I was young, my mother told me that loving someone means making yourself small so they can be big, Vivian said. I believed her. I spent 10 years making myself smaller and smaller, until I was barely visible even to myself. She turned, and tears tracked down her cheeks, the first he'd seen her shed in years. But here's what I learned, she continued. Love shouldn't require erasure. Real love makes space for two whole people. And you never made space for me, Cedric. You just expected me to disappear into your shadow. I'm sorry, he said again, the words useless and inadequate. I know you are, Vivian replied, but sorry doesn't give me back the years I lost. Sorry doesn't undo the damage. She retrieved her case, moving toward the door. Wait, Cedric said. Will you at least tell me where you're going, in case you die and want to say goodbye? She smiled sadly. No. You don't get that closure. You don't get to script my final scene in your tragedy. She paused in the doorway, silhouetted by the hall light, looking like something from a Renaissance painting, beautiful and unreachable and utterly beyond his grasp. Goodbye, Cedric, she said. I hope your last months bring you peace. I really do. Vivian, but the door closed and her footsteps faded down the hall, and then there was the distant sound of a carriage on the gravel drive. Cedric rushed to the window in time to see the coach pull away, carrying Vivian into the darkness beyond his gates. The fireworks continued overhead, celebrating a future she would live and he would not. He stood there until long after the coach disappeared, until the fireworks ended and the village lights winked out one by one. And for the first time in his 38 years, Duke Cedric Blackthorne understood the cruelest truth of all. You never know what you have until it's gone. And by then, it's already too late. The carriage disappeared into the January darkness, and Cedric remained at the window until dawn broke gray and merciless over the frozen grounds. He didn't sleep. Sleep required a kind of peace he no longer possessed. By morning, the entire household knew. Servants whispered in corners, their eyes sliding away when he passed. The head butler delivered breakfast with the stiff formality of someone attending a funeral. No one asked where Lady Vivian had gone. They already knew what mattered. She was gone, and she wasn't coming back. Cedric pushed the food away untouched. His body felt like it was collapsing from the inside, the disease and something darker eating through him simultaneously. He'd always assumed power meant control, over estates, over people, over outcomes. But Vivian had just demonstrated the one truth powerful men spend lifetimes avoiding. You can't control what someone else chooses to value, and the moment they stop valuing you, all your power becomes performance art in an empty theater. The Morning Post arrived with 3 letters. The first was from his solicitor, confirming receipt of the signed divorce papers. Efficient, bloodless, the dissolution of a decade reduced to legal boilerplate. The second was from Lord Ashford's scandal sheet, requesting comment on rumors that Lady Vivian had fled to the continent with a younger lover. Cedric crumpled it without finishing. The third made his blood stop. It was addressed in Vivian's precise handwriting, postmarked from the village station at 2 a.m. He tore it open with shaking hands. The letter contained one sentence. I left something for you in the East Tower Library. Nothing else. No signature. No explanation. Cedric stood so fast his vision blurred. The East Tower Library had been Vivian's private sanctuary for years, a small room overlooking the gardens where she'd spent countless hours reading while he entertained mistresses in the main house. He hadn't set foot in it since their second year of marriage, when she'd asked him to leave her at least one space that was entirely hers. He took the stairs faster than his failing body should have allowed, each step sending pain through his legs. The tower door was unlocked. Inside, winter light filtered through tall windows onto shelves of books Vivian had collected over the years. Poetry, philosophy, histories of women whose names had been erased from official records. On the reading desk sat a leather journal. Cedric opened it with hands that wouldn't stay steady. The first entry was dated 3 days after their wedding. He told me I looked beautiful last night. Then he left to visit her, the woman everyone knows about, except me, apparently. I smiled and thanked him for the compliment because that's what good wives do. We smile. We thank. We pretend not to notice our husbands can't wait to escape us. The handwriting was younger, rounder, hopeful in a way that made his chest ache. He flipped forward. Months of entries. Years. A chronicle of every betrayal, every humiliation, every moment she'd swallowed her pain to preserve his comfort. Today, I lost the baby, 6 weeks along. I hadn't told Cedric yet because he's been so distant lately, so consumed with that actress everyone's talking about. The physician says it was the stress from the fall. When I confronted Lady Margot at the winter ball, and she pushed me down the stairs while Cedric watched and did nothing. He asked me later why I was causing scenes. He didn't ask if I was hurt. Cedric's vision blurred. He didn't remember Vivian being pregnant, didn't remember any fall. The winter ball 4 years ago was a haze of champagne and Margot's skin under his hands in a darkened alcove. He kept reading, each page a knife. I paid off Lord Rothfield's clerk today. £50,000 to save Cedric from his own stupidity. He'll never know. He'll never thank me. He'll just continue believing he's brilliant and untouchable while I clean up the wreckage behind him like some invisible servant. Further on, I saw Cedric with the opera singer today. They didn't see me. He was touching her face the way he touched mine on our wedding night, before he learned to save his tenderness for other women. I went home and vomited until there was nothing left. Then I dressed for dinner and smiled when he complimented my hair. The journal entries grew colder as years passed, hope bleeding out line by line. The final entry was dated 2 days ago. I've decided to leave. Not because I hate him. Hate would at least mean I still feel something. I'm leaving because I finally understood that staying would kill me more certainly than any disease could kill him. Love shouldn't require self-destruction. And if it does, it's not love. It's just slow suicide dressed in wedding vows. Cedric closed the journal carefully, as if it might shatter. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air too thin. This was what Vivian had left him. Not anger, not recrimination, just evidence. The meticulous documentation of a woman watching herself disappear. He'd spent 10 years so focused on his own desires that he'd never noticed he was murdering someone by degrees. The realization didn't feel like redemption. It felt like waking up to find you'd been sleepwalking through a massacre and your own hands were covered in blood. Heck, Dr. Pemberton arrived that afternoon and found Cedric in the Tower Library, the journal open on his lap. Your Grace, you shouldn't be climbing stairs in your condition. Read this, Cedric interrupted, holding out the journal. I don't think... Read it, Cedric repeated. His voice sounded dead even to himself. I need someone else to confirm I'm not hallucinating, that I really was this much of a monster. Dr. Pemberton took the journal reluctantly. He was a discreet man, had served the Blackthorne family for 30 years, but even his professional composure cracked as he read. My God, he said finally. Did you know? Cedric asked. About the baby? I delivered it, Dr. Pemberton said quietly. What was left of it? Lady Vivian made me swear not to tell you. She said you had enough to worry about with your political career. Cedric felt something break inside his chest, some last fragile thing that had been holding his sense of self together. She almost died that night, Dr. Pemberton continued, his voice careful, clinical. The hemorrhaging was severe. I told her she might not be able to carry another child safely. She asked me if that would disappoint you. I didn't know what to say because we both knew you'd never wanted children with her in the first place. I never said that. You didn't have to, the doctor replied. A man who wants children with his wife doesn't spend every night in someone else's bed. The truth of it was brutal and inescapable. Dr. Pemberton closed the journal and set it down gently. What do you want me to say, Your Grace? That you can fix this? You can't. That you can make amends? You're dying. The only thing left is deciding whether you'll use your remaining time to wallow in self-pity or to actually change something that matters. Cedric looked up. What could I possibly change now? The doctor moved to the window, looking out over the grounds that would soon pass to some distant cousin who'd probably sell everything within a year. Lady Vivian sacrificed years protecting your reputation, your fortune, your political standing, he said. Perhaps you could spend your last months returning the favor. Make sure she's actually free, not just legally divorced, but socially, financially, politically untouchable. How? Dr. Pemberton turned and his expression held a challenge. You're still the Duke of Blackthorne. You still have influence, resources, connections. Use them for someone else's benefit for once in your miserable life. Cedric began that night. He called for his solicitor, his banker, and his political secretary. By dawn, he'd restructured his entire estate. The duchy and title would pass to his cousin as required by law. But everything else, the liquid assets, the investments, the properties not entailed to the title, he divided into 3 parts. 1/3 to establish a charitable trust for women fleeing abusive marriages. Vivian's name would be listed as founder, giving her instant credibility and social protection. 1/3 to create a publishing fund supporting female authors, with Vivian as the sole trustee. She'd mentioned once, years ago, that she wished she could help women whose voices were silenced. He'd ignored it then. He wouldn't ignore it now. The final third went directly to Vivian herself, structured in a way that no future husband could ever touch or control. She would be independently wealthy, untouchable, free. Your Grace, his solicitor protested, this is highly irregular. The scandal. I don't care about scandal, Cedric interrupted. I care about making sure that when Vivian reads my obituary, she knows I finally understood. Understood what? That she was worth more than everything I threw away to avoid loving her properly. The legal work took 3 days of constant effort. Cedric worked through pain that would have hospitalized a weaker man, driven by something that felt like purpose for the first time in years. On the 4th day, Lord Ashford published another column, this one gleefully reporting that the Duchess of Blackthorne had abandoned her dying husband for a cottage in Cornwall where she was reportedly living in scandalous isolation, probably entertaining a string of younger lovers. The tone devoured it. Dinner parties across London buzzed with speculation. Women who'd smiled at Vivian for years now whispered about her moral bankruptcy. Men who'd propositioned her at balls suddenly remembered her coldness with righteous indignation. Cedric read the column twice, memorizing every vicious line. Then he called for his carriage. "Your Grace," Dr. Pemberton protested, "you're not strong enough to travel to London." But "I'm not asking permission," Cedric said. "I'm informing you I'm leaving. You can either come with me or explain to my mother why you let me die alone on a roadside." The journey to London nearly killed him. Every rut in the road sent agony through his deteriorating body. By the time they reached his townhouse in Mayfair, Cedric was gray-faced and shaking, barely conscious. Dr. Pemberton put him to bed immediately. "You have perhaps 2 months left," he said bluntly. "Probably less after this idiocy. What could possibly be worth accelerating your death? Making sure Vivian doesn't spend the rest of her life drowning in the poison I created," Cedric replied. He spent the next morning writing letters. Personal letters to every major figure in London society. Not explanations. He didn't insult them with excuses. Just facts. To Lady Thornbury, the queen of social influence, "I'm writing to inform you that my wife's departure was not only justified, but long overdue. For 10 years, Lady Vivian demonstrated loyalty and grace while I publicly humiliated her. Her choice to leave represents not moral failure, but moral courage. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me, dying or not. To Lord Chancellor Pemberton, I am restructuring my estate to ensure Lady Vivian's financial independence. I trust you will ensure no legal challenges impede this. Consider it my final request to the Crown. I have served for 20 years. To the editors of every major newspaper, the next person who publishes speculation about Lady Vivian's character will find themselves facing libel suits from beyond the grave. I have set aside funds specifically for this purpose. Test me." He wrote until his hand cramped and his vision doubled. 30 letters. 40. 50. A systematic dismantling of the social machinery that would have crushed Vivian. Some recipients would ignore him, but enough wouldn't. Enough would recognize a powerful man using his last breath to protect someone, and that kind of gesture carried weight in circles where perception was everything. On the 5th day in London, Lady Margot arrived. She swept into his bedroom unannounced, her red dress a deliberate provocation. "Darling," she purred, "I heard you were in town. You should have told me. I would have prepared something special." "Get out," Cedric said. Margot laughed. "Don't be ridiculous. You need me now more than ever. Poor thing, abandoned by that frigid wife of yours." She reached for him, her fingers trailing across his shoulder. Cedric caught her wrist, his grip weak but his intention clear. "I said get out." The playfulness drained from Margot's face. "You're serious, completely, after everything we've meant to each other?" "We've meant nothing to each other," Cedric said. "You were entertainment. I was your meal ticket. Let's not pretend it was more." Margot's expression hardened. "You'll regret this. When you're dying alone, when there's no one to hold your hand—" "I already regret everything," Cedric interrupted. "But not this. Never this." He released her wrist. Margot stood there for a long moment, her beautiful face ugly with rage. Then she smiled, sharp and cutting. "You know what's funny? Vivian always knew. About us, about all of them. She knew and she stayed anyway. What does that say about her? It says she was loyal to someone who didn't deserve her loyalty," Cedric replied. "Now get out before I have you thrown out." Margot left without another word, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Cedric lay back against the pillows, exhausted but cleaner somehow. As if excising Margot from his life had removed some infection. Dr. Pemberton entered a moment later. I heard shouting. "It's handled." "Good," the doctor said, "because you have a visitor, your mother." "Christ," Cedric muttered. Dowager Duchess Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face carved from disapproval. "You look like death," she announced. "I am death," Cedric replied. "Or close enough." Eleanor settled into the chair beside his bed, her movements precise despite her age. "I received your letter," she said. "The one explaining what you're doing with the estate." "And I'm surprised," she admitted. "I didn't think you capable of selflessness." "I'm not being selfless," Cedric said. "I'm trying to repair damage I caused. That's just basic decency." "Basic decency would have been not causing the damage in the first place," Eleanor replied. "But I suppose deathbed virtue is better than no virtue at all." She pulled an envelope from her bag. I also received this. From Vivian. Cedric's heart stuttered. What does it say? Eleanor opened the letter, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. She asks me to ensure you don't do anything dramatic or self-destructive. She says she knows you're in London making grand gestures, and she'd prefer you simply rest and accept what's coming. She's writing to you about me? She's always written to me, Eleanor said. Weekly letters for the entire 10 years of your marriage. How else do you think I knew what you were doing? You knew? Cedric felt his world tilt again. You knew everything and you never said anything? I said plenty, Eleanor replied. You never listened. Men like you don't hear criticism until it's too late to matter. She folded the letter carefully. Vivian also says to tell you that your grand gestures are appreciated but unnecessary, that she's not leaving to punish you or to extract some final price. She's leaving because she deserves a life that doesn't revolve around managing your mistakes. Cedric closed his eyes. Even now, Vivian was being more gracious than he deserved. She also says, Eleanor continued, her voice gentler, that she hopes you find peace before the end, and that she forgives you even though she can't be near you anymore. That's worse, Cedric said. Her forgiveness is worse than her hatred. Yes, Eleanor agreed. That's how you know it's real. The scandal continued to spread through London like fire through dry brush. But something shifted after Cedric's letters began arriving. Lady Thornbury, whose opinion could make or break a reputation, was overheard at a dinner party saying that Lady Vivian had shown remarkable restraint given the circumstances. The Chancellor ensured legal filings moved forward without obstruction. 2 newspapers published retractions of previous speculation. It wasn't enough to erase the damage, but it was enough to give Vivian breathing room. Cedric received 1 response to his 50 letters. It came from Lord Rothfield, the man whose blackmail Vivian had secretly paid off years ago. The note was brief. I always wondered who bought those documents. She saved you twice. Once from me, once from yourself. Try not to waste it. Cedric kept that note on his bedside table, reading it whenever the morphine made him forget why he was doing this. His condition worsened daily. The disease was in his bones now, his organs. Dr. Pemberton stopped giving him time frames and started managing his pain in 4-hour increments. During the lucid moments, Cedric worked. He met with bankers to finalize the trusts. He signed documents until his signature became an illegible scrawl. He did everything he could to ensure that when he died, Vivian would be protected by more than just legal paperwork. She'd be protected by his reputation, deployed one last time for someone else's benefit. 3 weeks into his London stay, a letter arrived with a Cornwall postmark. Cedric's hands shook so badly Dr. Pemberton had to open it for him. The letter was short, written in Vivian's precise hand. Cedric, I heard about what you're doing in London. The trusts, the letters, the public statements. I want you to understand something. I don't need you to save me. I never did. I needed you to see me, to value me, to choose me. You couldn't do that when it mattered, and I've made my peace with it. Please don't spend your last weeks trying to rewrite history. Some things can't be fixed. They can only be survived. I survived you. That will have to be enough. Vivian. Cedric read it 3 times, then asked Dr. Pemberton to burn it. Why? The doctor asked. Because she's right, Cedric said. And I don't need the reminder that I'm still trying to make this about me instead of her. The doctor burned the letter in the bedroom fireplace. They watched the paper curl and blacken, Vivian's words turning to ash. That night, Cedric dreamed of the early days, before everything soured. Vivian in a yellow dress, laughing at something he'd said. The way she'd looked at him then, like he was someone worth admiring. The dream was so vivid he could smell her perfume, feel the warmth of her hand in his. He woke to gray dawn and the crushing knowledge that he'd taken that light and systematically extinguished it over 10 years of casual cruelty. Dr. Pemberton checked his vitals with professional detachment. Days now, he said, maybe a week. Arrange for me to go home, Cedric said, to Blackthorn Manor. Your Grace? I don't want to die in London, Cedric interrupted. I want to die in the house where I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me. Seems appropriate. The journey back to Blackthorn Manor nearly killed him 3 times. They had to stop twice for Cedric to vomit blood. By the time the carriage pulled through the estate gates, he was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. The staff carried him to his bedroom like they were moving a corpse. Perhaps they were. Cedric drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. During the brief moments of clarity, he found himself cataloging all the spaces in the manor where Vivian had existed. The morning room where she'd done her correspondence, the garden paths she'd walked each evening, the tower library where she'd hidden from him. The house felt haunted now, not by ghosts, but by the absence of someone who should have been there and chose to leave. On the third day, his mother arrived one final time. Eleanor sat beside his bed, her hand covering his. "You're fading," she observed. "Yes. Any last regrets you'd like to confess?" "Too many to list," Cedric said. His voice was barely a whisper now, each word requiring effort. "But the biggest is that I never told Vivian the truth." "What truth?" "That she terrified me," he said. "From the very beginning. She was so good, so genuinely kind and intelligent and strong. Being loved by her felt like standing in sunlight after living in darkness. It was overwhelming." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "So you pushed her away?" "I destroyed her," Cedric corrected, "because I was too weak to accept that kind of love, too afraid I'd fail to deserve it. So I failed preemptively. At least that way it was my choice." "That's the most honest thing you've ever said," Eleanor replied. Cedric closed his eyes. "Tell her," he said. "If you see her, tell her I finally understood." "Understood what?" "That love isn't about deserving, it's about choosing. And I chose wrong every single time." Cedric died on a gray February morning with rain drumming against the windows. No family surrounded him. His mother had returned to London the night before, unwilling to watch the final deterioration. No friends kept vigil. He'd never had friends, only allies and sycophants. Dr. Pemberton was there, monitoring vitals that were failing one by one. The physician had seen death countless times, but something about this one felt different, heavier. Just before the end, Cedric opened his eyes one last time. "Is she happy?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Dr. Pemberton knew exactly who he meant. "I believe she will be," he said, "given time." Cedric smiled, a fragile ghost of an expression. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." His eyes closed. He didn't open them again. The Duke of Blackthorn was pronounced dead at 11:43 in the morning, 6 months after his diagnosis, 4 weeks after his wife left him, and a lifetime after he'd had the chance to love her properly. The funeral was small despite Cedric's status. Most of London society sent polite condolences but declined to attend. Scandal still clung to the Blackthorn name, and death didn't erase it. Eleanor organized everything with military efficiency. She chose a modest service, refusing Cedric's request, written in one of his final lucid moments, for ostentatious display. He wanted simplicity, she told the handful of attendees. For once in his life, he'll get it. The notice went out to all relevant parties, including a telegram to Cornwall. Eleanor didn't expect a response. The day before the funeral, she received one. "I will not be attending. My mourning is private. Please respect this. V." Eleanor folded the telegram carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She'd expected nothing else. The service lasted 30 minutes. The priest, who'd never met Cedric, delivered generic platitudes about eternal rest and divine mercy. 3 distant cousins attended out of obligation, already calculating their claims to unentailed properties. Lord Rothfield appeared briefly, said nothing, and left before the burial. As they lowered Cedric's casket into the frozen ground, Eleanor noticed a figure standing at the cemetery gates. A woman in black, her face obscured by a veil, watching from a distance. Eleanor's breath caught. Vivian? But when she looked again, the figure was gone. Perhaps it had never been there at all, just the wishful thinking of an old woman hoping for narrative closure that life rarely provided. Yet, after the funeral, Eleanor traveled to Cornwall. She didn't announce her visit. She simply appeared at the cottage Vivian had rented, a small stone building overlooking the sea, and knocked. Vivian answered, looking different than Eleanor remembered. Her hair was shorter, shot through with silver she'd stopped dyeing. Her face was bare of cosmetics. She wore a simple dress and an expression of hard-won peace. "I thought you might come," Vivian said. She stepped aside. "Tea?" They sat in a sparse but comfortable sitting room. Through the window, waves crashed against rocks with relentless rhythm. "He's dead," Eleanor said, though Vivian obviously knew. "I know. You didn't come to the funeral." No, Vivian replied. I mourned Cedric years ago, when I finally accepted who he was and who he'd never be. Burying him felt redundant. Eleanor sipped her tea, studying the stranger who'd been her daughter-in-law. You've changed. I've remembered who I was before I tried to become what he needed, Vivian corrected. It's different. He tried to change too, Eleanor said. At the end. The trust, the letters, the... I know, Vivian interrupted gently. Your solicitor sent me the documents. The trusts are generous. Unnecessary, but generous. He wanted you protected. He wanted himself forgiven, Vivian said. There's a difference. Eleanor set down her teacup. You're harder than you were. I'm stronger, Vivian replied. Hard would mean I'm angry. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done. She stood, moving to the window. The light caught her profile, and Eleanor saw something she'd never noticed before. Vivian looked lighter somehow, unburdened. I've started a publishing house, Vivian said. Very small, very local. We're printing books by women who can't get traditional publishers. Stories about divorce, survival, finding yourself after spending years being someone else's wife. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. You're thriving. I'm surviving, Vivian corrected. Thriving might come later. For now, survival is enough. She turned from the window. Did he suffer? At the end? Eleanor considered lying, then decided Vivian deserved truth. Yes, the disease was brutal, but I think the suffering started long before his body failed. The moment you walked out, something broke in him. Good, Vivian said. The word hung between them. Does that shock you? Vivian asked. That I'm glad he suffered? No, Eleanor admitted. It makes you human. Vivian moved back to her chair, settling in with easy grace. I spent 10 years making myself smaller so Cedric could feel bigger. I shrank and shrank until I barely existed. And he never noticed, never cared. So yes, I'm glad that in his last weeks, he finally felt a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. She poured more tea, her hand steady. But I'm also glad he tried to change things. Not for his sake, it doesn't redeem him. But the trust will help other women. The money will fund real change. So even though his motives were selfish, the outcome is useful. That's remarkably pragmatic, Eleanor said. I learned pragmatism from you, Vivian replied. You always said sentiment was a luxury women can't afford. I did say that, didn't I? They sat in companionable silence, two women who'd survived the same man in different ways. Will you marry again? Eleanor asked finally. Vivian smiled. No. I've learned I'm better alone than with someone who makes me less than myself. Marriage is only valuable if it makes both people more than they were apart. Otherwise, it's just mutual parasitism. That's bleaker than I expected. Is it? Vivian tilted her head. I think it's hopeful. It means I know my worth now. I won't accept less than I deserve again. Eleanor stood to leave. She found herself oddly reluctant to go, to leave this cocoon of hard-won peace. At the door, she turned back. For what it's worth, I think you were the best thing that ever happened to him. I know I was, Vivian said. The tragedy is that Cedric only realized it when it was too late to matter. Eleanor returned to London with Vivian's words echoing in her mind. She spent the next week settling Cedric's final affairs, distributing properties, closing accounts. The duchy passed to a distant cousin who seemed pleasant enough if somewhat overwhelmed by his sudden elevation. The charitable trust and publishing fund went active within the month. Vivian's name appeared on the founding documents, lending instant credibility to both ventures. Society gossiped for a few weeks about the scandalous duchess, the dying duke, the mysterious trusts. Then newer scandals emerged and the Blackthorn story faded into memory. Eleanor lived 3 more years and spent them watching Vivian's publishing house grow from a cottage industry into something real. Books printed under Vivian's imprint began appearing in London bookshops, then Edinburgh, then Dublin. Stories of women finding themselves, stories of survival. Eleanor died in her sleep one autumn night and was buried beside her son. Before she died, she left Vivian a final letter. You asked me once if I thought Cedric ever really loved you. I've spent 3 years considering that question. Here's what I believe. Cedric loved you as much as he was capable of loving anyone. His capacity was simply too small, too corrupted by entitlement and selfishness. Asking if he loved you is like asking if a broken cup can hold water. The cup isn't refusing to hold water out of malice. It's just broken. You can forgive the cup for being broken. You can even grieve what the cup might have been if it had stayed whole. But you don't pour your life into it hoping things will change. You find a cup that isn't broken. Or better yet, you learn to drink straight from the stream. Be well, my dear. You were always too good for us. Vivian received the letter a week after Eleanor's funeral. She read it once, then filed it away with the other documents from that life. The divorce papers, the trust agreements, the final accounting of a decade spent loving someone who couldn't love her back. Then she walked down to the sea and stood watching waves crash against rock until the sun set and the sky turned the color of bruises healing. She thought about Cedric sometimes. Brief flashes of memory, his rare, genuine smiles, the way his hands used to shake when he was nervous before giving speeches. The one night early in their marriage when he'd held her after she'd learned her father was dying and whispered that everything would be all right. He'd been capable of tenderness. He'd just chosen to spend it elsewhere. Vivian turned from the sea and walked back to her cottage where a stack of manuscripts waited. Stories of women clawing their way back to themselves, one page at a time. She had work to do, a life to build, a future that belonged entirely to her. And for the first time in a decade, she woke up each morning without wondering if today would be the day Cedric finally chose her. Because the only person choosing her now was herself. And that turned out to be exactly enough. The publishing house thrived in ways Vivian hadn't anticipated. Within 18 months of its founding, Ashcombe Press had printed 47 books, employed 23 women, and earned enough revenue to expand into a proper office building in the village. Vivian worked 14-hour days, editing manuscripts, negotiating with printers, corresponding with authors whose stories deserved to be heard. She was happy. Or something close enough to happiness that the distinction didn't matter. Then the letter arrived that changed everything. It came on a Tuesday morning in late spring, delivered by special courier from London. The envelope was thick vellum, sealed with red wax bearing the royal insignia. Vivian's yet trembled slightly as she broke the seal, not from fear, but from the muscle memory of a decade spent in political circles where royal correspondence meant power was shifting somewhere. The letter was brief, signed by the Queen's private secretary. Lady Vivian, Her Majesty requests your presence at Windsor for a private audience regarding matters of estate and inheritance. Your attendance is expected within the fortnight. Accommodations will be provided. Vivian read it 3 times, searching for subtext. Estate and inheritance made no sense. Cedric's duchy had passed to his cousin, the trusts were settled, everything legal had been finalized months ago. She showed the letter to Mrs. Hardwick, her office manager, and the first woman she'd hired. The older woman had survived 2 abusive marriages and possessed the kind of street wisdom that came from rebuilding a life from rubble. Royal summons don't come without reason, Mrs. Hardwick said, adjusting her spectacles, especially not to women who've made themselves inconvenient. I haven't made myself anything, Vivian replied. I've been publishing books. Books about women leaving powerful men, Mrs. Hardwick countered. Books about financial independence and self-determination. You don't think that makes you inconvenient to certain people? Vivian felt something cold settle in her stomach. The publishing house had been deliberate, creating space for voices that threatened the established order. But she'd assumed she was too small, too remote to register as a threat. Perhaps she'd assumed wrong. Golk. Vivian arrived at Windsor Castle 2 weeks later, traveling alone despite Mrs. Hardwick's protests. The castle loomed against gray skies like a monument to permanence. Vivian had been here before during her marriage. State dinners and political functions where she'd smiled and said nothing while Cedric networked with men who decided the kingdom's future. She'd hated it then. Walking through the gates now felt like stepping back into a cage she'd barely escaped. A royal secretary met her in the entrance hall, a thin man with the kind of face that revealed nothing. Lady Vivian, he said, Her Majesty will see you shortly. In the meantime, Lord Chancellor Rothmore has requested a word. Rothmore. Vivian knew that name. He'd been one of Cedric's political allies, a man who'd attended their wedding and then spent the next decade pretending she didn't exist unless protocol required acknowledgement. She followed the secretary through corridors lined with portraits of dead monarchs. They stopped at a receiving room where Lord Rothmore waited, his bulk filling a chair that seemed too delicate for him. "Lady Vivian," he said, not rising. "How unexpected to see you here." His tone suggested her presence was anything but unexpected. "Lord Rothmore," she replied, remaining standing. "I was summoned by the Queen." "Yes, yes." He waved a dismissive hand. "About that. There's been a complication with your late husband's estate. Everything was settled months ago." "Not quite everything," Rothmore said. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You see, we've discovered certain irregularities in the trust documents your husband established before his death." Vivian's pulse quickened. "What irregularities?" "Financial improprieties," Rothmore said smoothly. "It appears the Duke of Blackthorn used funds from the Duchy Treasury, crown funds, technically, to establish your charitable trusts, funds he had no legal authority to disperse." "That's impossible," Vivian said. "His solicitors verified everything." "His solicitors made errors," Rothmore replied. "Errors we've only recently uncovered. Unfortunately, this means the trusts are legally invalid. All assets will need to be returned to the duchy." The room tilted. Vivian gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. "Those trusts support 23 employees and fund operations for—" "I'm aware of what they fund," Rothmore interrupted. "Quite the little empire you've built, printing seditious material, encouraging women to abandon their duties, undermining the natural order." "Natural order," Vivian repeated. Her voice came out flat, dangerous. "You know what I mean," Rothmore said. "Marriage, family, women knowing their place. Your publishing house promotes discord. It's unhealthy." "So this is what?" Vivian asked. "Punishment for writing books you don't like?" "This is correction of legal errors," Rothmore said. "Nothing personal." "Everything is personal," Vivian replied. "Especially when men like you decide what's legal and what isn't." Rothmore stood, his bulk suddenly threatening in the small room. "Be careful, Lady Vivian. You're not protected by a husband anymore. You're not protected by anything except our goodwill, and goodwill is a resource that depletes quickly." "Is that a threat?" "It's a reminder," Rothmore said. "The Queen will see you now. I suggest you listen carefully to what she has to say." Queen Adelaide was 70 years old and possessed the kind of power that didn't require raised voices. She received Vivian in a private sitting room, tea already poured. The Queen gestured to a chair, and Vivian sat because refusing would have been suicide. "Lady Vivian," the Queen said, "you've caused quite a stir. I've published books, Your Majesty." "Books that questioned the foundations of society," the Queen replied. "Books that encourage women to leave their marriages, to seek independence, to prioritize themselves over duty." "Books that tell the truth," Vivian said. The Queen sipped her tea. "Truth is a weapon, my dear. Wielded carelessly, it destroys as much as it liberates." Vivian said nothing. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. "I've read your publications," the Queen continued. "Quite compelling, actually. Well-written, emotionally resonant. I can see why they've gained traction. Then you understand their value." "I understand their danger," the Queen corrected. "You're teaching women to value themselves over stability, over order. That kind of thinking spreads like disease. Or like freedom," Vivian said. The Queen set down her teacup with a soft click. "Here's your situation, Lady Vivian. Lord Rothmore has identified legal grounds to dissolve your trusts. He has the documentation, the precedent, the authority. Your publishing house will cease operations within the month." Vivian felt her world fracturing. "Those trusts support real people, women who have nothing else. Which is why I'm offering you a choice," the Queen said. "Marry again. Someone appropriate, someone who can manage your affairs properly. A respected man who will ensure your activities remain within acceptable bounds. You want me to surrender my independence in exchange for keeping the trusts. I want you to demonstrate that you understand your place," the Queen said. "That you're not a revolutionary, just a grieving widow who temporarily lost her way." The trap was elegant. Refuse, and 23 women lose their livelihoods. Except, and everything Vivian had built, the autonomy, the self-determination, the hard-won freedom, evaporated. "And if I refuse?" Vivian asked. "Then the trusts dissolve, your assets are seized to repay the crown, and you return to Cornwall with nothing," the Queen said. "No money, no publishing house, no influence. You become irrelevant." Better irrelevant than owned, Vivian replied. The Queen's expression hardened. You think you're the first woman to choose pride over pragmatism? You think your defiance is noble? It's childish. You have power now, actual power to help women, but power requires compromise. It requires playing the game. I'm tired of games. Then you'll lose everything, the Queen said flatly. And the women who depend on you will suffer for your pride. The words hit like a physical blow. Vivian had spent so much energy escaping one cage that she hadn't noticed another being built around her. Who? She asked. Who would I have to marry? The Queen smiled. Lord Ashford has expressed interest. He's recently widowed, politically connected, and willing to overlook your unconventional history. Lord Ashford. The man who'd published vicious columns about her, who'd made her personal tragedy into public entertainment. The man whose face she wanted to claw every time she saw his byline. You can't be serious. He's eminently suitable, the Queen replied. Wealthy, titled, influential. He's agreed to allow the trust to continue under his supervision. Your publishing house would survive, under his control. Under proper management, the Queen corrected, you'd maintain creative input, of course, but final decisions would rest with your husband, as is appropriate. Vivian stood, her legs unsteady. This is extortion. This is reality, the Queen said. You have 1 week to decide. Marry Lord Ashford and keep your empire, or refuse and watch everything you've built turn to ash. Some choices aren't choices at all. All choices are choices, the Queen replied. You simply dislike the options. Vivian left Windsor in a daze, her mind spinning through scenarios that all ended badly. She traveled back to Cornwall and called an emergency meeting with her staff. 23 women crowded into the publishing house office, their faces reflecting the fear she felt. Mrs. Hardwick listened to Vivian's explanation of the situation with grim silence. When Vivian finished, the older woman said, So they're forcing you to choose between yourself and us. That's the core of it, Vivian admitted. Then the choice is obvious, Mrs. Hardwick said. You choose yourself. The room erupted in protest, but Mrs. Hardwick raised her hand for silence. Listen to me, all of you. We came to Ashcombe Press because Lady Vivian created a space where women could work without being owned. If she marries to save our jobs, she becomes owned again. And then what are we saving? A publishing house run by the exact kind of man we're writing against? But we need the work, another woman said. We have children, debts, nowhere else to go. I know, Mrs. Hardwick said gently, and it's vicious and unfair, but if we let them force Lady Vivian into another cage, we're complicit in our own oppression. The room fell silent. Vivian looked at these women, seamstresses, former governesses, mothers fleeing violent husbands. They'd rebuilt their lives around the opportunity she'd created. Destroying that felt like destroying them. What if I marry him? Vivian asked quietly. What if I maintain just enough control to keep things running? You won't, Mrs. Hardwick said bluntly. Men like Ashford don't share power. He'll shut us down within 6 months, probably sooner. He'll keep the prestigious parts, the profit, and dispose of anything that threatens him, which means us. So I'm supposed to just give up? You're supposed to fight, Mrs. Hardwick said. Not by surrendering to their terms, but by finding another path. What other path? Vivian demanded. The Queen controls the courts. Rothmore controls the legal framework. Ashford controls public opinion. What leverage do I possibly have? Mrs. Hardwick stood, her eyes bright with something fierce. You have the truth, and you have a printing press. Maats. Vivian spent 3 days locked in her office, writing. She wrote everything. The journal Cedric had left her, transcribed in full. The documentation of every scandal she'd covered up, every bribe she'd paid, every political manipulation she'd witnessed during 10 years as a duchess. The names, dates, amounts. Evidence of corruption that went far beyond Cedric, extending into the highest levels of government. She wrote about Rothmore's illegal trade agreements, about Ashford's blackmail schemes, about the Queen's private investments in companies that profited from keeping women legally powerless. She wrote until her hands cramped, until her vision blurred, until she'd created a document so explosive that publishing it would burn down the entire structure of power that was trying to destroy her. Then she set it in type. Mrs. Hardwick and 3 other women worked through the night, operating the printing press in secret. By dawn, they'd produced 500 copies of a pamphlet titled The Duchess Papers, A Decade of Corruption Exposed. Vivian held the first copy in trembling hands. Publishing this would be war. It would destroy reputations, end careers, possibly land her in prison for sedition or libel or treason. It would also free her. "Are you sure?" Mrs. Hardwick asked. Vivian thought about the Queen's ultimatum, about Lord Ashford's leering smile, about another decade spent making herself small so powerful men could feel big. "I'm sure," she said. They distributed the pamphlets before noon to every major newspaper in London, every political rival of the men she'd named, every reform-minded member of Parliament. They sent copies to universities, women's groups, literary societies. By evening, the scandal had exploded across the kingdom. Psst. The response was immediate and vicious. Lord Rothmore issued a statement denouncing the pamphlet as malicious fiction. The Queen's representatives called it treasonous lies. Ashford's newspaper published a column calling Vivian a deranged, vengeful woman whose grief had driven her mad. But the documents were too detailed to dismiss. The dates matched. The amounts could be verified. Other newspapers began investigating, finding corroboration for Vivian's claims. Within a week, 3 members of Parliament had resigned. Rothmore was under formal investigation. Even the Queen faced unprecedented public scrutiny, though her position remained untouchable. Lord Ashford, however, faced complete ruin. Vivian had documented his blackmail operations in meticulous detail, the mistresses he'd threatened, the rivals he'd destroyed, the bribes he'd taken. His newspaper lost advertisers overnight. His political allies abandoned him. His reputation disintegrated like wet paper. He arrived at Vivian's cottage on a gray morning, his face haggard with rage and fear. Vivian met him at the door with Mrs. Hardwick standing behind her, arms crossed. "You destroyed me," Ashford said. His voice shook with fury. "Everything I built, gone." "You destroyed yourself," Vivian replied. "I just documented it. I'll sue you for libel. I'll have you arrested for sedition. You'll do nothing," Vivian interrupted, "because everything I published is true and we both know it. Sue me and I'll present evidence in open court. Have me arrested and every newspaper in London will make me a martyr." Ashford's hands clenched into fists. "You think you've won? You've made enemies of the most powerful people in the kingdom." "I've exposed the most powerful people in the kingdom," Vivian corrected. "There's a difference. They'll find a way to destroy you." "They already tried," Vivian said. "That's why we're having this conversation." Ashford stood there, trembling with impotent rage. Then something in him crumpled. The bluster drained away, leaving only a broken man facing consequences for the first time in his privileged life. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "Nothing," Vivian said. "I don't want anything from you. I want you out of my life permanently. The trusts are being restructured under different legal frameworks," Vivian said. "I've already filed new paperwork with courts outside Rothmore's jurisdiction. The publishing house will continue operations." "How?" "Because I learned something from 10 years with Cedric," Vivian replied. "Power isn't about who's strongest. It's about who's willing to burn everything down rather than accept chains." Ashford stared at her, and something like recognition flickered across his face. "You've become exactly what they feared." "No," Vivian said. "I've become exactly what I should have been all along." The fallout continued for months. Rothmore was forced to resign, though he avoided criminal charges through connections Vivian couldn't reach. Several other officials faced investigations. The Queen weathered the scandal with her usual implacable calm, though her political capital took damage. Ashford disappeared from public life entirely, retreating to a country estate where he lived in self-imposed exile. And Vivian's publishing house exploded in success. The scandal had made her famous, or infamous, depending on perspective. Women across the kingdom sent her manuscripts, letters, stories of their own battles against systems designed to crush them. Ashcombe Press became a symbol of resistance, proof that speaking truth could crack even the most fortified walls of power. But victory came with costs Vivian hadn't anticipated. She couldn't walk through London without being recognized. Half the people who saw her offered support, the other half spat at her feet. She received death threats weekly, marriage proposals daily, and enough correspondence to require 3 assistants just to manage the volume. The isolation was profound. She'd burned bridges with everyone connected to her old life. No invitations to social events, no friendly correspondence from former acquaintances. She'd become too dangerous to associate with, a living reminder that women could choose themselves over the comfort of powerful men. On a cold November evening, 6 months after publishing the pamphlet, Vivian sat alone in her cottage office reviewing manuscripts. Mrs. Hardwick had gone home hours ago. The other staff had families to return to, but Vivian had only this: the work, the mission, the relentless forward momentum that kept her from thinking too deeply about what she'd sacrificed. A knock at the door startled her. She answered to find Eleanor's former lady's maid, now elderly and frail, standing in the darkness. "Miss Pemberton," Vivian said, surprised. "It's late. Is something wrong?" The woman held out a sealed letter. "From the Dowager Duchess," she said. She left instructions to deliver this if certain conditions were met. Those conditions have now been met. Vivian took the letter with trembling hands. Eleanor had been dead for 4 months. What conditions? The woman smiled cryptically. "You published the truth despite the cost. That was the condition." She turned and disappeared into the night before Vivian could ask more questions. Inside, Vivian broke the seal with shaking fingers. Eleanor's handwriting covered 3 pages, cramped, precise, uncompromising. "Dearest Vivian, if you're reading this, you've done something brave and possibly stupid. You've chosen yourself over safety, truth over comfort, freedom over acceptance. I'm proud of you. I'm also worried for you. Because here's what no one tells women who fight the system. Winning doesn't feel like winning. It feels like exile. You'll be alone more than you can imagine. People will call you bitter, angry, unfeminine. They'll say you're using Cedric's death for attention, that you're a cautionary tale about what happens when women forget their place. And some days you'll believe them. Some days the loneliness will crush you and you'll wonder if surrender would have been easier. On those days, remember this: easy doesn't mean right. Comfortable doesn't mean just. You're building something that will outlive you, a world where women don't have to choose between themselves and survival. That work is holy, even when it feels hopeless. I never told you this while I lived, but I admired you from the moment you married my son. Not because you loved him, that was foolish, but because, beneath all that devotion, I saw steel. I saw a woman capable of standing alone if necessary. It took you 10 years to find that steel again. Don't bury it now. The publishing house will face more attacks. They'll try different tactics: financial, legal, social. They'll offer you compromises that sound reasonable but slowly strangle everything you've built. Refuse them all. Keep printing truth. Keep making space for voices they want silenced. Keep choosing yourself. And when the loneliness threatens to destroy you, remember, you're not alone. Every woman who reads your books, who leaves her cage because you showed her the door was never locked, she's with you. Every girl who grows up knowing she doesn't have to shrink herself for anyone's comfort, she's with you. I'm with you too, even in death. You were the daughter I should have had instead of the son I got. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it. Be fierce, my dear. Be uncompromising. Be exactly as difficult as the world needs you to be. With all my love and respect, Eleanor." Vivian read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with Cedric's journal, the divorce papers, and all the other documents from that life. She didn't need them anymore. Didn't need to carry the weight of who she'd been or who she'd almost become. She was building something new now, something that couldn't be controlled, couldn't be owned, couldn't be destroyed by men who saw women as property to be managed. The next morning, Vivian received notice that a consortium of conservative politicians was attempting to pass legislation restricting women's access to printing presses. The bill specifically targeted publishers who promoted moral dissolution and societal discord. It was another attack, another attempt to silence her. Mrs. Hardwick brought the news with grim determination. "They're never going to stop, are they?" "No," Vivian said. "They're not. So what do we do?" Vivian looked at her staff. Women who'd risked everything to work here, who showed up every day knowing they were targets, who kept printing truth despite the cost. "We fight," she said simply. "We print faster, distribute wider, speak louder. We don't give them the satisfaction of our silence." "They'll destroy us eventually," another woman said quietly. "Maybe," Vivian agreed, "but we'll make them work for it. And every day they spend trying to destroy us is a day they're not destroying someone else. She stood, moving to the window overlooking the sea. The water was gray and choppy, waves crashing against rocks with relentless determination. Cedric spent his entire life trying to control outcomes, Vivian said, to shape the world according to his needs. It made him powerful, but it also made him hollow. Because control is an illusion. The only thing we actually control is whether we speak truth or swallow it. She turned back to her staff. I can't promise we'll win, she continued. I can't promise safety or success or even survival. But I can promise that every book we print, every woman we employ, every truth we speak, it matters. It changes something, even if we can't see the change yet. The room was silent. Then Mrs. Hardwick stood. I'm in, she said, whatever comes. One by one, the other women stood as well. Me too. And me. I'm not going anywhere. Vivian felt something fierce and painful expand in her chest. Not happiness. She was too exhausted for happiness. But purpose. Meaning. The bone-deep knowledge that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she needed to do. That night, alone in her cottage, Vivian lit a fire and sat watching flames consume the logs. She thought about Cedric, dead and buried, about Eleanor who'd understood too late, about the Queen and Rothmore and Ashford and all the powerful men who'd tried to cage her. They'd failed because they'd made the same mistake Cedric had made. They'd assumed her love, her devotion, her need for approval would override her need for freedom. They'd been wrong. Vivian Ashcombe didn't need anyone's approval anymore, didn't need protection or patronage or permission. She just needed her printing press, her truth, and the unshakable conviction that some things were worth burning for. The fire crackled. Outside, waves crashed. Inside, Vivian sat surrounded by manuscripts from women who'd found their voices. And somewhere in the darkness, the machinery of power was already organizing its next attack. But for tonight, in this moment, Vivian was exactly who she'd fought to become. Alone, free, unbreakable, and ready for whatever came next. The legislation passed 3 months later. The Printing Decency Act became law on a frigid February morning, signed by the Queen herself despite weeks of public protest. The language was deliberately vague, prohibiting publications that promoted moral dissolution, undermined family structures, or encouraged women to abandon their natural duties. In practice, it meant Ashcombe Press was now illegal. Vivian received the official notice from a stone-faced magistrate who arrived with 4 constables. He read the decree aloud while her staff stood frozen, their faces reflecting the terror Vivian felt but refused to show. You have 72 hours to cease all operations, the magistrate said. Any materials printed after that deadline will be seized. Any person found operating this press will face imprisonment. On what grounds? Vivian demanded. On grounds that Parliament and Her Majesty have determined your publications constitute a threat to public order. We publish stories, Vivian said. Women's experiences. Truth. You publish sedition, the magistrate replied, and the law is clear. He handed her the papers and left with his constables, their boots echoing on the wooden floors like a death march. The moment they were gone, the staff erupted. This can't be legal. They can't just shut us down. What are we supposed to do? Vivian raised her hand for silence. Her mind was already racing through options, calculating angles, searching for the leverage that had to exist somewhere in this rigged game. How many books do we have ready to print? She asked Mrs. Hardwick. 14 manuscripts. Final edits complete. And how much paper do we have in storage? Mrs. Hardwick's eyes widened as she understood. Enough for maybe 3,000 copies. If we run the presses continuously, Vivian looked around at her staff. Women who'd risked everything to work here, who'd found purpose in printing truth that powerful men wanted buried. We have 72 hours, Vivian said. So we print everything, every manuscript, every story. We flood the kingdom with so many books they can't possibly seize them all. They'll arrest us, someone said. Probably, Vivian agreed. But they can't arrest readers. They can't arrest every woman who hides a book under her mattress or passes it to her daughter. We print now, distribute fast, and make sure the words survive, even if we don't. The room went silent as the magnitude of what she was proposing settled over them. I won't force anyone to stay, Vivian continued. This is dangerous. Criminal, according to the new law. If you need to leave, leave now. No judgment, no consequences. Nobody moved. Mrs. Hardwick stepped forward. We're not going anywhere, she said. You gave us dignity when the world offered only chains. If they want to stop us, they'll have to drag us out. One by one, the other women nodded agreement. Vivian felt something fierce and painful expand in her chest. Not hope exactly, but something harder. The kind of determination that came from having nothing left to lose except the work itself. Then we work, she said. 72 hours. No sleep, no stopping. We print until they tear the press from our hands. They worked like women possessed. The printing press ran continuously, its rhythmic clatter filling the building day and night. Women took shifts, some operating the machinery, others binding pages, others packaging finished books for distribution. They worked through exhaustion, through cramping hands and blurred vision, and the constant fear of constables arriving early. Vivian moved through the chaos, coordinating everything, her mind sharp despite the lack of sleep. She'd sent word to sympathetic booksellers across the kingdom, to women's groups in every major city, to anyone who might hide books until the initial crackdown passed. The response was overwhelming. Coded messages arrived hourly. We'll take 50 copies. Send whatever you can. We have hiding places ready. The underground network Vivian hadn't even known existed was mobilizing, women across the kingdom preparing to smuggle banned books like contraband. On the second night, Lord Ashford appeared. He arrived alone, without constables or threats, looking older than Vivian remembered. The scandal had broken him in ways that went beyond reputation. Something in his spine had collapsed, leaving him diminished. Vivian met him at the door, blocking entry. You're not welcome here. I know, Ashford said. His voice was hoarse, defeated. I came to warn you. They're planning to move early. Tomorrow morning, not 72 hours from now. They want to catch you with active presses. Why would you warn me? Ashford looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Because I spent my entire career destroying people for profit. And I'm tired of being that man. The confession hung between them. You're still that man, Vivian said. One warning doesn't erase decades of cruelty. I know, Ashford agreed. But maybe it's a start. He turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, you terrified us. All of us. Because you proved that power isn't permanent, that reputation can be destroyed, that the systems we built to protect ourselves are actually just elaborate cages we constructed. Is that supposed to make me forgive you? No, Ashford said. Nothing will make you forgive me. I just wanted you to know that you won. Not the way you probably wanted to win, but you changed something fundamental. Women across the kingdom are watching you fight. And that scares powerful men more than any army. He walked into the darkness, and Vivian never saw him again. She returned to the press room where her staff was still working. Change of plans, she announced. They're coming tomorrow morning. We have maybe 12 hours. The women didn't panic. They just worked faster. By dawn, they'd printed 2,847 books, 14 different titles, stories of survival and resistance, and women choosing themselves over the comfort of powerful men. The books were stacked throughout the building, waiting for distribution that would now have to happen under threat of immediate arrest. Vivian stood in the center of her press room, surrounded by the physical manifestation of everything she'd built. Her body ached with exhaustion, her hands were stained with ink, her throat was raw from shouting instructions over the machinery. She'd never been more certain of anything in her life. Mrs. Hardwick approached carrying a final bound copy, the last book printed before they'd have to destroy the press to keep it from being seized. This one's yours, she said, handing it to Vivian. The title was embossed in gold, The Duchess Papers, 2nd edition. They'd expanded Vivian's original pamphlet into a full book, adding documentation of the new legislation, the arrests of women activists, the systematic silencing of dissent. It was evidence. Testimony. A record for future generations of exactly how the powerful crushed those who threatened them. Vivian held the book like something precious and fragile. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Hardwick replied. We still have to survive what comes next. Footsteps on the street outside made everyone freeze. Through the window, Vivian saw constables assembling. Not 4 this time. At least 30, maybe more. They carried clubs and chains, prepared for resistance. Leading them was Lord Rothmore himself, despite his supposed resignation. Power didn't release its grip easily, even in disgrace. Vivian moved to the door, stepping outside alone to meet them. Rothmore's smile was vicious. "Lady Vivian, you've been busy." "We've been working," Vivian corrected. "Legally, I might add. We still have 12 hours before your deadline." "The deadline has been moved," Rothmore said, "by executive order. Your operations are now illegal as of this moment. How convenient." "Quite." Rothmore gestured to his constables. "Seize everything. The presses, the books, the equipment. Arrest anyone who resists." The constables moved forward. Vivian stood her ground. "You can take the books. You can destroy the presses. But you can't destroy what they represent." "Can I?" Rothmore asked. "Watch me." The constables pushed past Vivian into the building. She heard crashes as they began destroying equipment, the splintering of wood and metal as they dismantled the machinery. Her staff's voices rose in protest, then screams as constables grabbed them roughly. Vivian tried to push back inside, but two constables caught her arms. "You're under arrest," one said. "Sedition, incitement, violation of the Printing Decency Act." They forced her to her knees on the cobblestones. The rough stones scraped her skin through her dress. She could hear her life's work being destroyed inside the building, could hear women who'd trusted her being arrested for the crime of telling truth. Rothmore stood over her, triumphant. "You should have married Ashford when you had the chance. You should have accepted your place." "My place was never on my knees in front of men like you," Vivian said. "And yet here you are," Rothmore replied. A constable was bringing chains when the crowd appeared. They came from everywhere at once. Women from the village, from neighboring towns, from across the countryside. Seamstresses and shopkeepers, governesses and widows. Women who'd read Ashcombe Press books and found something in those pages that made them feel less alone. They didn't carry weapons. They just stood there, hundreds of them, blocking the street. Rothmore's face went pale. "This is an illegal assembly. Disperse immediately." The women didn't move. "I said disperse!" Rothmore shouted. A woman in the front, someone Vivian didn't recognize, spoke up. "You can arrest her. You can destroy her press. But you can't arrest all of us." Another voice joined. "We've all read the books." And another. "We all know the truth now." More voices, building like a wave. "You can't silence everyone. We're not afraid anymore. You've already lost." The constables looked uncertain, outnumbered by sheer presence, if not force. They were trained to handle criminals, not crowds of ordinary women who'd decided they'd had enough. Rothmore's hand trembled as he pointed at Vivian. "This woman is a criminal. She's violated the law." "So arrest her," someone shouted, "and then arrest all of us for reading her books." Rothmore spun toward the crowd. "You don't understand what you're doing. You're defending sedition, treason. We're defending ourselves," a woman called back. "You just can't tell the difference." The standoff stretched. Constables gripping clubs, women standing firm, Vivian on her knees between them, her body aching but her spine straight. Something was breaking in this moment, some invisible structure that had held women in place for generations. Vivian could feel it fracturing, the old certainties crumbling. Rothmore must have felt it too because his face went from pale to red with rage. "Arrest them all," he snarled. "Every single one." The constables hesitated. "I said arrest them." "My lord," one constable said carefully, "there are too many. We don't have enough chains. Then beat them until they disperse." The constable looked at the crowd, mothers and daughters, grandmothers and granddaughters, women who looked like his sister, his wife, his daughter. Something in his face changed. "No," he said quietly. Rothmore's eyes bulged. "What did you say?" "I said no, my lord." The constable lowered his club. "These are civilians. We're not soldiers. I won't beat unarmed women for the crime of reading books." Another constable lowered his weapon. Then another. Rothmore looked around wildly, watching his authority evaporate in real time. "You're all dismissed. All of you. I'll have you charged with dereliction of duty." "Then charge us," a constable said. "But we're not doing this." The constables began backing away, leaving Rothmore standing alone. The women in the crowd moved closer, creating a human barrier between Vivian and Rothmore. "This isn't over," Rothmore hissed. "I'll bring the military. I'll have martial law declared. You think you've won? You've just made everything worse." "Maybe," Vivian said, standing on shaking legs. But you can't put us back in the cage anymore. That's what terrifies you. Not that we're fighting, that we've stopped being afraid. Rothmore stared at her with pure hatred. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. The moment he disappeared around the corner, Vivian's legs gave out. Mrs. Hardwick caught her, supporting her weight. "We did it," she whispered. "No," Vivian said. "We survived today. Tomorrow they'll come back with different tactics. This isn't victory. It's just the beginning of a much longer war." Inside the building, the constables had destroyed 3 presses before abandoning the raid. But one remained intact, hidden in the back room. And the books. Most of the books had been distributed before Rothmore arrived. 2,847 stories scattered across the kingdom like seeds. Vivian looked at the women surrounding her, strangers who'd risked arrest to defend a publishing house they'd never visited, defending ideas more than any individual. This was the thing powerful men never understood. You could destroy a person, but you couldn't destroy the hunger for freedom once women tasted it. You could burn books, but you couldn't burn the words already living in people's minds. That night, Vivian sat in her destroyed office surrounded by her staff. "They'll regroup," Mrs. Hardwick said. "Probably come back with actual soldiers next time." "I know," Vivian said. "So what do we do?" Vivian looked at the one remaining press, battered but functional. "We rebuild. We adapt. We print in secret if we have to. We distribute through underground networks. We make it impossible to stop because there's no single point of failure." Her mind was already working through logistics. Smaller presses in different locations, coded distribution systems, networks of safe houses, the machinery of resistance. Mrs. Hardwick studied her. "You've changed since Cedric died. You know that. I've become who I should have been all along," Vivian said. "Someone who doesn't mistake survival for living. And if they kill you for it?" "Then I'll die free," Vivian said simply. "Which is more than I could say for the 10 years I spent trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it." The words settled over the room like a benediction. They worked through the night making plans, building contingencies, preparing for the next attack. Because there would be another attack. And another after that. The powerful didn't surrender their power just because ordinary people stood up. But here's what Vivian understood now. What 10 years with Cedric and 3 years of freedom had taught her. Endurance was a weapon. The ability to survive, to rebuild, to keep fighting when fighting seemed impossible, that outlasted armies and legislation and the rage of powerful men. She thought about Cedric sometimes, wondered what he'd think of who she'd become. Would he be proud? Horrified? Probably both. But it didn't matter anymore. His opinion, his approval, his version of who she should be, all of it was dust. The only person Vivian needed to satisfy was herself. Dawn broke cold and gray over Cornwall. Somewhere in London, Rothmore was probably organizing his next attack. Somewhere in Windsor, the Queen was calculating her response. Somewhere across the kingdom, men in power were trying to figure out how to crush this uprising before it spread further. Let them try. Vivian stood at the window watching the sunrise, Mrs. Hardwick beside her. "Do you ever regret it?" the older woman asked. "All of this. The fight. The danger." "Every day," Vivian admitted. "But I regret the alternative more. Which is spending my life making myself smaller so men could feel bigger. That's not survival. That's just slow erasure." The sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. There was a knock at the door. Urgent, insistent. Vivian and Mrs. Hardwick exchanged glances. Too early for casual visitors, too aggressive for friendly ones. Vivian opened the door to find a young woman, barely 20, her dress torn and her face bruised. "Please," the woman gasped. "They're hunting us. The women who came yesterday. Rothmore's men are arresting everyone who was in the crowd. They're saying we're conspirators. They're taking us to prison." Behind her, Vivian could see smoke rising in the distance. The village. They were burning homes, probably. Destroying evidence. Terrorizing anyone who dared to stand up. Mrs. Hardwick appeared at Vivian's shoulder. "How many?" "Dozens," the young woman said. "Maybe 100. They're going house to house." Vivian's mind raced. This was escalation beyond anything she'd anticipated. Rothmore wasn't just attacking the press anymore. He was making an example of everyone associated with it. "Get inside," Vivian said quickly. The woman stumbled through the door. Vivian looked out at the rising smoke, at the distant sounds of chaos spreading through the village. This was her fault. These women had stood up because she'd inspired them. Now they were paying the price for her revolution. The weight of it threatened to crush her. Mrs. Hardwick gripped her shoulder. "This isn't on you," she said, reading Vivian's expression. "This is on them, on men so terrified of losing power that they'll burn the world to keep it. Doesn't change the fact that people are suffering because of me." "No," Mrs. Hardwick agreed, "but stopping now would mean their suffering was for nothing." More figures appeared in the distance, women running toward the cottage, seeking shelter. Vivian made a decision. "Get the books," she told her staff. "Every copy we have left, we're distributing them now. Today. Before Rothmore can seize them." "That's insane," someone said. "They'll arrest us on sight." "They're already arresting us," Vivian replied. "At least this way the books survive." She turned to Mrs. Hardwick. "Send word to every contact we have. Underground networks, sympathetic booksellers, women's groups. Tell them we need emergency distribution. Every book needs to disappear into hiding before nightfall." Mrs. Hardwick nodded and moved to comply. Vivian looked at the women flooding into her cottage, frightened, hurt, but still standing, still refusing to go back to being silent. "Listen to me," Vivian said, her voice cutting through the panic. "They're trying to terrify us into submission, and it's working. I'm terrified. But fear is only useful if it makes us smarter, not smaller." She moved to the center of the room. "We have two choices. We can surrender, turn ourselves in, apologize, accept whatever punishment they decide. Or we can fight, not with violence. We'd lose that battle, but with persistence, with the refusal to disappear just because it's easier for them." "What does fighting look like?" someone asked. "It looks like surviving," Vivian said. "Hiding the books, protecting each other, building networks they can't map, becoming impossible to destroy because we're everywhere and nowhere. That's not fighting, that's running." "Sometimes running is fighting," Vivian replied. "Sometimes the greatest act of resistance is simply refusing to die." The room went quiet. Vivian looked around at these women, ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances because they dared to imagine a world where their voices mattered. "Here's the truth none of us wanted to face," Vivian said. "This was never going to be easy. Power doesn't surrender because you ask nicely. It doesn't yield because you're right. It only moves when you make it more expensive to maintain than to relinquish." "So we make it expensive," Mrs. Hardwick said. Vivian nodded. "Every book distributed is a cost. Every woman who refuses to be silenced is a cost. Every day they have to spend hunting us instead of governing is a cost. We bleed them slowly. We make resistance so exhausting that eventually it's easier to let us exist." "That could take years," someone said. "Probably," Vivian agreed. "Maybe decades. Maybe longer than we live. But the alternative is going back to silence. And I'd rather die fighting than live as someone's property." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Outside, the smoke was spreading. Vivian could hear distant shouts, the sound of systematic destruction as Rothmore's forces worked through the village. They were coming, probably within the hour, and when they arrived, they wouldn't be gentle. Vivian moved to the window, watching the approaching chaos. She thought about Cedric, dying alone and desperate. About Eleanor, fierce until the end. About every woman who'd sacrificed herself thinking it would earn her love, protection, value. All of them learning too late that survival required choosing yourself first. Vivian had learned that lesson. She'd paid the price of 10 years to understand it. And now she was teaching it to women across the kingdom, whether the kingdom wanted to learn or not. Mrs. Hardwick appeared beside her. "They're almost here." "I know," Vivian said. "Last chance to run." "I'm done running," Vivian replied. She turned from the window to face her staff, these women who'd become soldiers in a war they'd never anticipated fighting. "When they come, we don't resist violently," Vivian said. "We make them arrest us. We make them put chains on mothers and grandmothers in front of witnesses. We make them show the kingdom exactly what power looks like when it's threatened. And then?" "And then we survive," Vivian said. "In prison or in hiding or in whatever hell they create for us. We survive and we remember. And someday, when the world is ready, we rise again. The sound of marching boots echoed up the street. Vivian straightened her spine, wiped the ink from her hands, and prepared to meet whatever came next. Because here's what Cedric had never understood, what powerful men throughout history had never understood. You could destroy a woman's body, her livelihood, her reputation, her freedom, but you couldn't destroy her will to exist on her own terms. And that will, once awakened, was the most dangerous force in the world. The door burst open. Soldiers flooded in, weapons drawn, and Vivian stood her ground, unbroken, unbowed, and absolutely unafraid, because she'd already lost everything she was willing to lose. And women with nothing left to lose were the only thing powerful men should truly fear. The soldiers dragged Vivian and 17 other women into the street. Their hands were bound with rope that bit into skin, leaving marks that would take weeks to fade. The commanding officer, a colonel whose nameplate read Morrison, directed his men with clinical efficiency, treating the arrest like a military operation rather than the capture of unarmed civilians. Vivian stumbled on the cobblestones, her exhausted body finally giving out. A soldier caught her roughly, hauling her upright with no gentleness. "Keep moving," he muttered. Behind them, more soldiers were ransacking the cottage. Vivian could hear furniture being overturned, papers being torn, the systematic destruction of everything she'd built. They were looking for evidence, for lists of names, for anything that would help them map the network of resistance spreading across the kingdom. They wouldn't find much. Vivian had learned caution the hard way. The women were loaded into 2 covered wagons like cargo. No explanation of where they were going, no charges read aloud, just the brutal application of power that no longer bothered with legal pretense. Mrs. Hardwick sat beside Vivian in the wagon, her gray hair disheveled but her spine straight. "Well," she said quietly, "I suppose we knew it would end like this." "I thought we'd have more time," Vivian admitted. "We had exactly the time we needed," Mrs. Hardwick replied. "The books are distributed. The words are out there. Nothing they do to us changes that." The wagon lurched forward, heading toward whatever fate the powerful had decided for women who refused to stay silent. Vivian closed her eyes and thought about Cedric, about the man who'd controlled everything in his sphere except the one thing that mattered, his own capacity for love. He'd died surrounded by wealth and title and political influence, and none of it had filled the emptiness where connection should have lived. She was going to die differently, probably in a prison cell or on a scaffold, but she'd die knowing she'd fought for something beyond her own comfort. That had to count for something. The journey took 6 hours. When the wagons finally stopped, Vivian heard ocean waves and smelled salt air. They were coastal, but north of Cornwall, somewhere remote. The soldiers hauled the women out into gray afternoon light. They stood before a massive stone fortress that looked like it predated the kingdom itself, all thick walls and narrow windows designed to keep people in rather than welcome them. "Welcome to Raven's Hollow," Colonel Morrison announced. "Your home for the foreseeable future." "On what charges?" Vivian demanded. Morrison looked at her with something almost like pity. "Sedition, incitement to riot, violation of the Printing Decency Act, conspiracy against the crown." "Should I continue?" "Those charges require trial." "Perhaps in peacetime," Morrison said. "But Parliament has declared a state of civil emergency. Trials are suspended until order is restored." "You mean until we're forgotten?" Vivian said. Morrison didn't answer. He just gestured for his soldiers to move the prisoners inside. The fortress interior was worse than the exterior suggested. Long corridors lined with cells, each barely large enough for one person. The air smelled of mold and human misery. Women's voices echoed from deeper in the complex, moaning, crying, the sounds of people slowly being broken. Vivian and her staff were separated immediately. She caught one last glimpse of Mrs. Hardwick being shoved into a cell 3 corridors away, and then she was alone. Her cell was 6 feet by 8 feet. A stone bench along one wall. A bucket in the corner. A single barred window too high to reach. The door clanged shut with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Vivian sat on the bench and let the reality of her situation settle over her. She was imprisoned without trial, possibly indefinitely. Her publishing house was destroyed. Her staff was scattered through this fortress, separated and probably terrified. The movement she'd started was being systematically crushed. By any objective measure, she'd lost. But sitting there in that cell, Vivian felt something unexpected. Peace. Not happiness. Not satisfaction. Just the deep bone-level certainty that she'd made the right choices even if they'd led to this moment. Because the alternative, continuing to make herself smaller, continuing to swallow her truth, continuing to live as an accessory to someone else's life, that would have been a different kind of prison. One without walls or bars, but a prison nonetheless. She'd chosen freedom over safety. She'd chosen herself over approval. And if the price was this cell, then she'd pay it. Because Vivian had finally learned what Cedric never understood. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is survive the consequences of your own choices without regret. Days blurred into weeks. The guards brought food twice daily, thin gruel and stale bread that barely sustained life. They allowed no visitors, no correspondence, no information about the outside world. Isolation was part of the punishment, designed to make prisoners feel forgotten. But Vivian discovered something unexpected in the silence: clarity. Without the constant pressure of running the press, managing staff, fighting battles on every front, her mind finally had space to process everything that had happened. The 10 years with Cedric, the escape to Cornwall, the publishing house, the final confrontation. She thought about the woman she'd been on her wedding night, young, hopeful, genuinely believing that love and devotion would be enough. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. She thought about the woman who'd placed divorce papers on Cedric's bedside table, harder, colder, but finally willing to choose herself. That woman had been necessary, a cocoon stage between versions of herself. And now she was becoming someone else entirely. Someone who understood that strength wasn't about never falling. It was about standing up afterward, scarred and tired and unbroken in the ways that mattered. On the 37th day of imprisonment, a guard appeared at her cell with an unexpected message. "You have a visitor," he said. Vivian looked up, confused. Visits weren't allowed. She'd asked repeatedly and been denied every time. The guard unlocked her cell. "Come with me." He led her through corridors to a small meeting room. Inside, sitting with perfect posture and an expression of barely contained rage, was someone Vivian had never expected to see again. The Queen. Adelaide sat alone, without guards or attendants, in a simple dark dress that made her look older than Vivian remembered. When she saw Vivian, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, at how much Vivian had changed in just over a month. Vivian's hair was matted, her dress filthy. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her skin was pale from lack of sunlight, but her eyes were clear, and her spine was straight. "Your Majesty," Vivian said, not bowing. The Queen studied her for a long moment. "Sit," she said finally. Vivian sat. They faced each other across the scarred wooden table like opposing generals negotiating terms. "You've caused me considerable difficulty," the Queen said. "I published books," Vivian replied. "You caused yourself difficulty by trying to suppress them." The Queen's lips thinned. "Do you know how many women have been arrested in connection with your publishing house? How many families disrupted? How much unrest your actions have caused? Do you know how many women lived in silent desperation before those books gave them language for their pain?" Vivian countered. "How many daughters will grow up knowing they don't have to accept abuse as the price of survival?" The Queen looked away, something working in her jaw. "You don't understand the forces you've unleashed." "I understand them perfectly," Vivian said. "You're just uncomfortable because you can't control them." Silence stretched between them. "I came to offer you a deal," the Queen said finally. Vivian laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. "Another deal. Marry someone appropriate. Apologize publicly. Promise to be a good girl who doesn't cause trouble." "Not quite," the Queen said. "I'm offering you exile." Vivian's laughter died. "Leave the kingdom," the Queen continued. "Never return. In exchange, I'll release your staff and drop all charges against the women arrested during the raid. They'll be free to go home. And the publishing house? Remains illegal," the Queen said, "but I won't actively hunt down every book in circulation. What's already distributed, I'll allow to exist in the shadows." Vivian stared at her. "Why would you offer that?" "Because this isn't sustainable," the Queen admitted. "Every woman we arrest creates 10 sympathizers. Every book we burn makes the remaining copies more valuable. We're losing more ground fighting you than we'd lose by letting you disappear, so I'm more useful gone than imprisoned." "Precisely," the queen said. "You become a cautionary tale either way, but an exiled revolutionary is less inspiring than a martyred one." The calculation was cold and accurate. Vivian could see the logic. Her death in prison would create a symbol. Her exile would just create an absence. "Where would I go?" Vivian asked. "France, perhaps. America. Anywhere beyond my jurisdiction." The queen leaned forward. "This is generous, Lady Vivian. More generous than you deserve." "Is it?" Vivian asked. "Or is it the only move you have left that doesn't make things worse for you?" The queen's expression hardened. "You can accept exile, or you can rot in this cell for the rest of your life. Those are your options." Vivian thought about her staff, imprisoned in cells throughout this fortress, about the women in the village who'd been arrested for standing in her defense, about all the people suffering because they'd believed in something she'd started. If I accept exile, everyone else goes free? No charges, no harassment, no retaliation? "You have my word." "Your word," Vivian repeated. "The same word you gave when you promised the Printing Decency Act wouldn't target legitimate publications?" The queen stood abruptly. "I'm offering you life, you ungrateful girl. Life and freedom." "Many women in your position would beg for such mercy." "Many women in my position would never have ended up here," Vivian replied, "because they'd have accepted their cages quietly." "Then stay in yours," the queen snapped. "Die here forgotten while the world moves on without you." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "You remind me of myself," she said quietly, not turning around. 40 years ago, before I learned that power requires compromise, I thought I could change things too. I thought being queen meant having the authority to make the world better. "And?" Vivian asked. "And I learned that power is a cage too," the queen said. "Just a more comfortable one. You spend so much energy maintaining it that you forget what you wanted it for in the first place." She turned back and her face looked ancient suddenly, carved by decades of compromise and calculation. "Take the exile," she said. "Build your life somewhere else. Let someone else fight this battle." "Why do you care what I choose?" "Because watching you destroy yourself over principles that won't change anything is exhausting," the queen said. "And because despite everything, I respect you enough to want you to survive." The admission hung in the air between them. "I'll consider your offer," Vivian said. "You have 3 days," the queen replied. "After that, the offer expires and you remain here permanently." She left without another word, leaving Vivian alone in the meeting room. Ditik. Vivian spent the next 3 days wrestling with the choice. Exile meant life, freedom of a sort, the possibility of building something new in a place where her past didn't define her. She could write, could publish in countries beyond the queen's reach, could continue the work from a distance. But it also meant abandoning the women who'd fought beside her, leaving the kingdom at the moment when the movement needed visible leadership most, becoming exactly what the queen wanted, absent, irrelevant, erased from the narrative. On the second night, a guard slipped a note under her cell door. Vivian unfolded it with trembling hands. The handwriting was Mrs. Hardwick's, somehow smuggled through the prison network. "Take the exile. We'll survive. The work continues with or without you. Don't let them kill you over symbolism." Simple, direct, practical as always. But beneath it, in different handwriting, another message. "We need you alive more than we need you here." And beneath that, more messages, smuggled signatures from her staff, from women she'd never met, from people who'd read her books and found something worth fighting for. Take the deal. Survive. Live. Keep writing. Don't let them win by making you a martyr. Vivian read the messages until she'd memorized every word. Then she burned the paper in the small lamp flame, destroying the evidence that could implicate the people who'd sent it. She thought about Cedric again, about his deathbed realization that he'd wasted his life chasing the wrong things, about how he'd tried to make amends too late, when the only thing left was dying with slightly less regret. She didn't want to die with regrets, didn't want to sacrifice herself for symbolism when she could survive to fight differently. But she also didn't want to live as a coward who abandoned her principles the moment the cost became real. The answer, when it finally came, felt both simple and impossibly complex. Survive, but don't surrender. Chess. On the third day, Vivian sent word that she'd accept the queen's offer. The response was immediate. Within hours, she was brought before the Queen again, this time in a proper office rather than the prison meeting room. "You've made the right choice," the Queen said. "I've made a choice," Vivian corrected. "Whether it's right remains to be seen." Papers were produced, formal documents of exile, releases for her staff, guarantees of safe passage. Vivian read every word carefully, looking for loopholes or traps. There were some, of course. The exile was permanent and irrevocable. Any attempt to return would result in immediate arrest and execution. Any attempt to publish materials targeting the kingdom from abroad would void the agreement and reinstate all charges against her staff. Clever. The Queen was ensuring that Vivian's voice would be muted, even in exile. Vivian signed anyway, because her staff's freedom was worth more than her pride. "You'll leave on a ship tomorrow morning," the Queen said, "bound for France. You'll be given enough money to establish yourself. After that, you're on your own." "Generous," Vivian said dryly. "Practical," the Queen corrected. "I want you gone, not destitute and desperate enough to return." "One condition," Vivian said. The Queen's eyebrows rose. "You're not in a position to negotiate." "Nevertheless," Vivian said, "I want to see my staff before I leave, to say goodbye properly." The Queen considered this. 1 hour. Supervised. No seditious planning. Agreed. Jim Mumpt. They brought the women into a common room the next morning, all 17 of them, looking thin and tired but unbroken. Mrs. Hardwick embraced Vivian first, her arms surprisingly strong. "You're doing the right thing," she whispered. "I'm doing the only thing," Vivian replied. "Same difference." The other women clustered around, and for a few minutes they were just people again, not prisoners or revolutionaries, just women who'd worked together and fought together and somehow survived. "What happens to the press?" someone asked. "The one they didn't destroy?" Mrs. Hardwick smiled grimly. "Already moved. New location, we'll keep printing, just smaller and more careful." Vivian felt something tight in her chest loosen. "You're continuing?" "Did you think we'd stop just because you're gone?" Mrs. Hardwick asked. "You started this, Vivian, but it's bigger than you now." The words should have stung. Instead, they felt like liberation. "Print everything," Vivian said. "Every story you can find. Make them work harder and harder to silence you." "We will," Mrs. Hardwick promised. "And someday, when things change, you'll come home." "Maybe," Vivian said. "Or maybe home is wherever the work continues." They talked for the full hour, making plans and sharing memories and saying the things that needed to be said before permanent separation. When the guards finally came to end the visit, Vivian hugged each woman individually. Mrs. Hardwick was last. "Thank you," Vivian said, "for everything. For believing in this when it was just a crazy idea. For standing beside me when it became dangerous." "Thank you for showing us we could stand at all," Mrs. Hardwick replied. The guards led Vivian away. She looked back once and saw her staff standing together, supporting each other, already planning their next move. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that the work would continue. The ship departed at dawn. Vivian stood at the rail, watching England recede into morning mist. Somewhere in that gray distance was Blackthorn Manor, empty now except for servants and a distant cousin who'd inherited a title he'd never wanted. Somewhere was Cornwall, her cottage, the life she'd built and lost. Somewhere was Cedric's grave, a monument to a man who'd learned too late what mattered. The wind was cold and sharp, carrying salt spray that stung her eyes. Vivian pulled her cloak tighter and turned her face toward France, toward whatever future waited in exile. She thought about Eleanor's letter, about being fierce and uncompromising. She thought about Cedric's journal, documenting his slow realization that power without connection was just elaborate loneliness. She thought about every choice that had led her to this moment, standing on a ship, heading into exile, alone but not broken. A voice beside her made her turn. "Rough crossing," a man said. He was older, maybe 60, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years at sea. "You traveling alone?" "I am," Vivian said. "Brave," he replied. "Or foolish. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." "Often the same thing," Vivian agreed. They stood in companionable silence, watching the coastline disappear. "What takes you to France?" the man asked eventually. "A new beginning," Vivian said. Or maybe just the continuation of an old fight in a new place. The man nodded like this made perfect sense. I found the best fights are the ones you choose rather than the ones chosen for you. Vivian looked at him sharply. That's unusually philosophical for a casual conversation. He smiled. I'm a publisher, he said, based in Paris, always looking for writers with something worth saying. Vivian felt something shift in her chest. What's your name? Laurent Beaumont, he said. And you are? Vivian Ashcombe, she replied. Recognition flickered across his face. The Duchess Papers, he said. I published the French translation 6 months ago. Sold 20,000 copies before your government pressured ours to ban it. Vivian stared. You published my work? Without permission, I'm afraid, Beaumont said. But in my defense, revolutionary texts don't usually come with formal copyright arrangements. No, Vivian said slowly. They don't. Beaumont studied her with interest. So, the infamous Duchess exiled to France. That's quite a story. It's my story, Vivian said, and I'm not done telling it. Good, Beaumont replied, because I have a printing press in Paris and a reading public hungry for exactly the kind of truth you write. He pulled a card from his pocket and handed it to her. This is my address. Come see me when you're settled. We'll discuss terms. Vivian took the card, her mind already racing with possibilities. New books, new audience, new language for the same old fight. Why would you risk it? She asked. Publishing my work again after it's been banned? Beaumont's smile was sharp. Because power that fears words is power already crumbling, and I've spent my whole life printing the things powerful people want silenced. They shook hands, and Vivian felt the future rearrange itself into something almost hopeful. France was different from England in ways both obvious and subtle. The light hit differently. The language flowed with rhythms Vivian had studied but never fully mastered. The social structures were familiar but twisted slightly, like looking at England through warped glass. Beaumont's publishing house occupied a narrow building in the Latin Quarter, surrounded by bookshops and cafes where writers and artists argued politics over cheap wine. Vivian felt immediately at home in a way she'd never felt in London's rigid social circles. They published her first French book 3 months after her arrival, a memoir of her marriage to Cedric, her escape, and her fight to create Ashcombe Press. She wrote it in English, and Beaumont hired a translator who captured not just her words but her voice. The book was controversial immediately. Conservative papers called it propaganda. Progressive papers called it necessary. Women across France bought it in numbers that surprised even Beaumont. Within a year, Vivian had published 3 more books, collections of the stories Ashcombe Press had printed, essays on women's independence, analyses of power structures designed to keep women subordinate. The work was different from running a press, but the mission was the same, creating space for voices that had been silenced. She lived simply in a small apartment overlooking the Seine. No staff, no luxury, no trappings of her former life. Just books and writing and the occasional visit from other exiles and revolutionaries who passed through Paris. She never married again. Several men expressed interest, but Vivian had learned that partnership required someone willing to see her as a whole person rather than a project to be managed. Those men were rare, and she'd rather be alone than diminished. Letters arrived periodically from England, smuggled through underground networks. Mrs. Hardwick sent updates on the continuing work, smaller presses operating in secret, books distributed through networks the authorities couldn't map, a movement that had learned to survive without centralized leadership. The news wasn't always good. Women were still being arrested. The Printing Decency Act was still in force. But the resistance was adapting, becoming harder to destroy because it was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Vivian read these letters and felt proud of what they'd built together. Not a single publishing house, but an idea that couldn't be imprisoned. 5 years after her exile, Vivian received a letter that changed everything. It came through official channels rather than smuggled networks, sealed with the royal insignia. She opened it with trembling hands, fearing new persecution, new threats. Instead, it was an invitation. Lady Vivian Ashcombe, you are hereby invited to return to England under full pardon. All charges have been dropped. The Printing Decency Act has been repealed. Your citizenship and property rights are restored. Queen Adelaide. Vivian read it 3 times, searching for tricks or conditions. There were none. She took the letter to Beaumont, who read it with narrowed eyes. "It's legitimate," he said finally. "The seal is genuine. The language is official." "But why?" Vivian asked. "Why would she pardon me now?" Beaumont handed back the letter. "Because you won," he said simply. "Not the way you expected, not quickly, but your books, your ideas, they've been changing minds for 5 years. Even the Queen can't hold back a tide once it's started." Vivian sat down heavily. "I don't know if I want to go back." "You don't have to," Beaumont said. "You've built a life here. You're safe, productive, respected." "But?" Vivian prompted. "But your work started in England," Beaumont said, "and perhaps it needs to finish there too." Eek. Vivian returned to England on a grey autumn morning 3 weeks later. The ship docked at Dover, and she stepped onto English soil for the first time in 5 years, feeling like a stranger in the country of her birth. Everything looked familiar but felt foreign, like a childhood home visited after decades away. She traveled to London first, to the address the Queen had provided. Windsor Castle looked exactly as she remembered, imposing, eternal, a monument to power that had outlasted centuries of individual monarchs. The Queen received her in the same sitting room where they'd negotiated exile. Adelaide was older now, her hair completely white, her face marked by years of navigating politics Vivian could only imagine. But her eyes were still sharp, still calculating. "You came," the Queen said. "You invited me," Vivian replied. "I wasn't certain you would accept." They sat across from each other, the table between them feeling less like a barrier than before. "Why did you repeal the Act?" Vivian asked. The Queen sipped her tea. "Because it wasn't working. Arrests increased, unrest grew. Women were hiding books like contraband and passing them mother to daughter like heirlooms. We'd created exactly the problem we tried to prevent. So you surrendered." "I adapted," the Queen corrected. "There's a difference." Vivian studied her. "You didn't invite me back just to tell me that." "No," the Queen agreed. "I invited you back because I've been thinking about what you said, about power being a cage." And I've decided to open some of the doors," the Queen said. "Not all of them, not quickly, but enough to let air flow through." She set down her teacup. "I'm establishing a commission on women's legal rights," she continued, "examining marriage laws, property rights, employment restrictions. I want you to serve on it." Vivian stared. "You want me to work with the government?" "I want you to change it from the inside," the Queen corrected. "You've proven you can fight from the outside. Now prove you can build from the inside." The offer was unexpected and complicated. Working within the system meant compromise, meant accepting gradual change instead of revolutionary transformation. But it also meant actual power to shape laws, to create lasting structural change instead of just resistance. "I'll need guarantees," Vivian said. "Protection for everyone who worked with me. Pardons for all the women arrested under the Act. Full restoration of Ashcombe Press's legal standing." "Done," the Queen said. "Anything else?" "The Commission needs teeth," Vivian continued. "Real authority to propose legislation, not just advisory opinions." "Agreed. And I reserve the right to publish criticism of the government's pace of change." The Queen smiled slightly. "I wouldn't expect anything else." They negotiated for another hour, hammering out details and protections. When they finished, Vivian had more than she'd dared hope for, genuine opportunity to create change within the structures she'd spent years fighting. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why give me this power after trying so hard to destroy me?" "Because I'm 74 years old," the Queen said, "and I've been thinking about legacy, about what I want the kingdom to remember me for." She stood, moving to the window overlooking the grounds. "I could be remembered as the Queen who crushed dissent, who kept women in their place, who maintained order at any cost," she continued. "Or I could be remembered as the Queen who listened when her people demanded change, who had the courage to evolve." "That's remarkably progressive," Vivian said carefully. "It's remarkably pragmatic," the Queen corrected. "The world is changing whether I approve or not. I can fight it and lose, or I can guide it and maintain some influence over the outcome." She turned back and her expression was unreadable. "You taught me that," she said. "By refusing to disappear, by continuing to fight even from exile, by proving that ideas are harder to kill than people." Vivian felt something complex and uncomfortable. Not quite forgiveness for the woman who'd imprisoned her, but maybe the beginning of understanding. "I'll join your commission," she said, "but I won't be your tame revolutionary. I won't pretend change is happening faster than it is just to make you look good." "I wouldn't trust you if you did," the Queen replied. Vivian traveled to Cornwall the next day. Her cottage was exactly as she'd left it, maintained by Mrs. Hardwick in her absence. The publishing house building had been repaired and expanded, now operating legally under new ownership that was really just Mrs. Hardwick and the original staff. They celebrated her return with tears and embraces and hours of catching up. The work had continued, Mrs. Hardwick explained. Smaller than before, more careful, but continuous. They'd printed 73 books in 5 years, employed 62 women, created a network that stretched across the kingdom. "You did all this while I was gone," Vivian said, awed. "We did it because you taught us how," Mrs. Hardwick replied. "You showed us that fighting was possible. We just continued the fight." Vivian looked around at these women, older now, marked by years of struggle, but unbroken. They'd survived her absence and built something sustainable. "The publishing house doesn't need me anymore," Vivian said softly. "No," Mrs. Hardwick agreed, "but the commission does. Go build the legal protections we need. We'll keep printing the stories that remind people why those protections matter." It felt right somehow. Division of labor between the structural and the cultural, the legal and the literary. Vivian spent a week in Cornwall, reacquainting herself with the sea and the cottage and the rhythms of life she'd left behind. Then she returned to London to begin the hard, slow work of changing laws. Moscow. The commission met monthly for 3 years. Progress was glacial. Every proposed reform faced resistance from conservatives who saw any change as chaos. Every victory was partial, compromised, smaller than what was needed. But slowly, things shifted. They reformed marriage laws to give women more autonomy. They expanded property rights so wives could own assets independently. They created legal mechanisms for women to escape abusive marriages without being destitute. Small changes. Incremental. Frustrating in their modesty. But real. Vivian published throughout, documenting the process and criticizing its pace. She became a controversial figure again, celebrated by progressives, despised by conservatives, impossible to ignore. She was 53 when the commission finished its work. The final report ran to 300 pages of recommendations, roughly half of which were adopted into law. Not enough, but more than nothing. The Queen invited Vivian to a private dinner to mark the occasion. They sat across from each other one last time, both older now, both marked by the compromises and battles of years spent reshaping a kingdom. "You've accomplished remarkable things," the Queen said. "We've accomplished some things," Vivian corrected. "Remarkable would be full equality under law. What we've achieved is a foundation. Always pushing for more," the Queen said. "I suppose that's why you've been effective." "It's why I've been necessary," Vivian replied. The Queen smiled. "I'm stepping down," she said. "My health is failing. My grandson will take the throne next month." Vivian absorbed this. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," the Queen said. "I'm tired. And I've done what I set out to do, leave the kingdom better than I found it, even if better is still far from good." She pushed a document across the table. "This is my final act as Queen," she continued. "Elevating you to the peerage, Lady Vivian Ashcombe, Baroness of Cornwall, for services to the crown and kingdom." Vivian stared at the document. "You're giving me a title?" "I'm giving you permanent legal standing," the Queen corrected. "A seat in the House of Lords. Constitutional authority to continue pushing for change long after I'm gone." It was clever, Vivian realized. Not a reward, but a weapon, giving her the institutional power to keep fighting. "Why?" Vivian asked. The Queen's expression softened. "Because you were right," she said. "That day you told me power is a cage. I've spent 40 years trapped in mine, making compromises that protected the institution at the expense of people. But you've never let the cage define you." She stood, moving to the window. "I want someone in the Lords who remembers what it's like outside the cage," she continued, "who will keep pushing even when it's easier to accept things as they are." Vivian joined her at the window, looking out over London. "I'm not the revolutionary I was," Vivian said. I'm older, more tired, more willing to accept gradual change. Good, the Queen replied. Revolutionary fervor burns bright but burns out. What we need now is sustained pressure, relentless advocacy, someone who won't give up just because progress is slow. They stood together in silence, two women who'd been enemies and were now something more complicated, allies bound by shared understanding of how difficult meaningful change actually was. Thank you, Vivian said finally, for the pardon, for the commission, for this. Thank you for not letting me crush you, the Queen replied, for surviving long enough to prove that resistance matters. Vivian returned to Cornwall one last time before taking up her seat in the Lords. She visited Cedric's grave for the first time since his death, a simple stone marker in the Blackthorn family plot, overgrown with ivy. She stood there for a long time, thinking about the man she'd married and the man he died as, about the 10 years she'd wasted trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it, about the brutal grace of walking away. I forgive you, she said finally, not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying anger was exhausting and I have better things to do with my energy. The words felt true as she spoke them. Cedric had been weak and selfish and destructive, but he'd also been broken in ways he'd never understood or addressed. Hating him achieved nothing except keeping her chained to the past. She left a single flower on his grave, not from love, but from completion, the final gesture of someone closing a chapter. Then she walked to Eleanor's grave, marked with an imposing monument that somehow also felt humble. You were right about everything, Vivian said. About Cedric, about power, about the cage. I wish you'd lived to see what came after. She stayed until sunset, then returned to her cottage. Mrs. Hardwick was waiting with tea and the kind of comfortable silence that came from decades of friendship. Ready for London? She asked. No, Vivian admitted, but ready rarely matters. We do the work that needs doing, whether we feel prepared or not. That's the most Eleanor thing you've ever said, Mrs. Hardwick observed. Vivian smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. They talked late into the night about the future, the publishing house's expansion plans, Vivian's legislative agenda, the slow grinding work of changing a kingdom one law at a time. Around midnight, Vivian walked down to the sea one last time. The water was dark and restless, waves crashing against rocks with the same relentless rhythm they'd maintained for millennia. She thought about how much had changed in the past 15 years. Her marriage, her exile, her return, how much she'd lost and what she'd gained. She'd never remarried, never had children, never built the conventional life society said women should want, but she'd lived on her own terms. She'd fought for something larger than herself. She'd survived the destruction of everything she'd built and then built again differently. And standing there on the cliff overlooking the sea, Vivian felt something she'd never felt during her marriage to Cedric. Complete. Not happy in the simple, uncomplicated way of people who'd never fought for anything, but satisfied in the deeper way of someone who'd faced the worst parts of themselves and the world and come through still believing change was possible. The wind carried salt spray and the promise of storms. Vivian pulled her cloak tighter and turned back toward her cottage, toward London, toward whatever battles waited. She was older now, tired, scarred by years of fighting, but unbroken. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not whether you won every battle, not whether change came as fast as you wanted, just whether you kept fighting, kept believing, kept choosing yourself even when the cost was brutal. Vivian had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, by losing everything, by being exiled, by having to rebuild from nothing. But she'd learned it, and now she'd spend whatever years remained teaching it to anyone willing to listen. Because that was the real legacy, not the books or the laws or the institutional changes, just the simple, radical act of showing other women that survival was possible, that you could walk away from cages disguised as love, that you could build a life that belonged entirely to you. That was enough. That was everything. And as Vivian walked back to her cottage under stars that had witnessed countless stories of struggle and survival, she finally understood what Cedric never had. The measure of a life wasn't power or wealth, or how many people bowed when you entered a room. It was whether you'd lived according to your own values, fought for something worth fighting for, and died knowing you'd tried. Everything else was just noise. The cottage door closed behind her with a soft click. Inside, warmth and tea and the work that would fill her remaining years. Outside, the sea continued its eternal conversation with the shore. And somewhere in the darkness, the future was already forming, shaped by the words she'd written, the laws she'd helped create, the countless women who'd read her books and realized they didn't have to accept cages as their natural habitat. Vivian poured tea and sat at her writing desk. Tomorrow she'd travel to London, take her seat in the Lords, and continue the fight. But tonight, she'd simply sit in the cottage she'd chosen, living the life she'd built, and allow herself the rare grace of contentment. Not because everything was perfect, but because she was finally, completely, irrevocably free. And that had always been the point.